Everybody to session 4 of our 2026 Responsible Raw Materials Conference. This is session 4 of 6. So, Aileen, Miranda, and all the team behind the scenes, we're halfway there. Isn't this exciting? It's always a good point in the conference when we realise that we still haven't lost our voices quite yet. But also as well, I feel like my brain is full of so much amazing information and different perspectives with regards to be it certainty, uncertainty, or just sheer chaos in the world round about us, and trying to find those little inklings of hope or different tools through which we can, be it on a personal level or a company level or a national level, try and navigate some of what's going on in the world of raw materials. My name is Dr. Sarah Gordon, and I am your host, or perhaps even your guide, as we try and navigate through this conference. And I'm joined by the fantastic Dr. Aileen Duran and Miranda Shirley, who you can see on the screens. And we don't say a big enough thank you to either of them or everybody else, such as Helen and Joss and everybody else behind the scenes who are making this conference such a success. So, in case you've missed it, don't worry. We have put together an awful lot of free TV. Yes, we will not even charge you a Netflix or an Amazon Prime or a Now TV or whatever else subscription. You can go straight to our website, and there you will find all of the talks, not just from the last few days, but from the previous 6 conferences that we have run. So, Responsible Raw Materials was set up in the depths of COVID, actually because we had an amazing intern student. She was doing her PhD and she was supposed to do lots of exciting work in the company that most of us work with. And of course, COVID scuppered all of that, and we thought, right, well, what else can we do instead? And one of the, I guess, needs that came to mind or pain points was that lots of people care about raw materials, but we often come from different directions and we rarely meet one another. We rarely find ourselves in the same room, and often we just speak to other people in the same bubbles as ourselves. And while the likes of mining all the way through to recycling, it may feel like you're the only people that do it. Actually, if you work for a mining company, there will be people in civil society organizations, for example, that you've probably never met. And it's really interesting to hear those different perspectives. And by collaborating or certainly listening to different people, we can then hopefully improve how we actually do things and make sure we achieve bigger goals rather than just providing the metals and minerals that we need for our future. So, Responsible Raw Materials was born all the way back in 2020. And if you look at our past events drop down menu, you can actually go back and you can take a laugh at how much younger we all looked back then. I think this is just experience that is showing on my face, or maybe it's just a few days of this conference. I always look a little bit tired by the time we get to this, but you can go back in time and you can click on any of the speakers, and you'll see that the videos are there together with some background information. And we've even actually got the text to Christopher Reeve's talk that he gave all the way back in 2020. So it's a really exciting resource that you can go back and raid. And over the years, we've had different themes to our conferences. So back in 2020, we asked the question, what do we actually mean by responsible raw materials? In 2021, we said, right, okay, well, we know that we need to do this in a responsible way, but what does that actually mean and how do we do it? So we provided a toolbox. We called it the ESG toolbox, but use whatever language you wish. Then in 2022, we looked at the role of mining, or the potential role of mining, in unlocking a truly just transition. So what does that actually mean? 2023, we looked at the criticality of trust. And I'm proud to say that we were probably one of the first conferences that started talking about trust. See, everybody else copies us, which is a good thing because perhaps we're just inspiring those conversations to happen. No, it's all good. I am by no means claiming the word trust in any sense or form. In 2024, we looked at critical choices. So, how do you make those decisions? And then in 2025, so last year, we looked at collaboration and charting success together. Now, each of these topics has been inspired through lots of different conversations with many of you, and thank you very much for engaging with all of that. But of course, very much inspired by what's going on in the world round about us. And I don't think anybody can dispute the fact that there's quite a lot of change going on around us right now, not just, of course, in the world of raw materials, but in order to perhaps just settle ourselves a little bit, how do we how do we get better at navigating that change? Because it's not going to stop, but perhaps we can get a little bit better at predicting some of it, or if nothing else, making ourselves feel a bit more comfortable with that uncertainty. Because, of course, on a very deeply personal level, for many people, it can feel deeply unsettling. Unless, of course, you're a geologist, and most geologists are trained to revel in the world of uncertainty, because the deep secret is none of us really know what is under the ground. And if a geologist tells you they do know exactly what is beneath the Earth's surface, they are either deluded or lying. So there we go. I've said it here, and I am a geologist, and I'm now probably going to get expelled from the profession. Anyway, with all of that in mind, if you go to this year's conference page, you can see that you can click on this button and watch live on YouTube. Hello to those of you who are already doing that. And if you scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page, you will find the agenda for each of our sessions. So, for example, we had session number 1, which was a couple of days ago on Tuesday. And of course, today we're here in session 4. Thursday morning, 8 a.m. UK time. But greetings to those of you who are dialing in from all around the world. On that note, I think actually our global presence has been truly amazing. We've had people dialing in from everywhere, from, I'm looking at Miranda and Aileen here, Indonesia and the Philippines, Australia. We've had people from India, Cameroon, Ghana, South Africa, Botswana, all across Europe, and then into both South and North America as well. So it's been absolutely amazing to welcome all of you to this conference. And as always, the chat is there for all of you to engage. Please do feel free to share your thoughts, your feelings. We do have a code of conduct, but it's very simple. It basically says just respect one another. So if anybody is naughty or being disrespectful, then we do have means to deal with you. But ultimately, we do want to hear your perceptions. And we also acknowledge that we have very different ideas often on some of the topics that we're discussing. So with regards to what we're going to be talking about today, as you can see, our lineup is, I mean, every session is phenomenal, but I've been really looking forward to today's session. Not least because we finished today's session with Fiona Clowder. Now, Fiona, you are not, I could say you're not here. Well, you are here, but you're currently traveling. Where are you right this second?
Good morning, everybody. I'm talking to you from Madrid, where I've just spent an excellent couple of days at the Madrid Energy Conference, run by the Institute of Americas, where we've been talking more from the energy side, but talking very much about links between Europe and Latin America. So I'm looking forward to talking more about that and more about the critical minerals side.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Fiona. And thank you for taking the time away from beautiful Madrid to dial into the conference. Absolutely brilliant. So we've got Fiona, who's currently in Madrid. We've got Jan Henk. And Jan Henk, where are you dialing in from? I mean, I think your name might give a hint.
Just a little bit, right? I'm actually dialing in from the Hague in the Netherlands, which I guess some of you might have guessed.
Exactly. I love your name. It is truly glorious. But thank you
At
very
some
much.
point, I need to give you a translation of it.
I know. Yeah, we certainly do. We need that. So we've got Jan Henk dialing in from the Netherlands. We've got Anthony Duran. Now you may have noticed that Anthony has the same surname as Aileen. And Aileen, where's your brother dialing in from when he arrives?
Actually, the UK, near Manchester.
Excellent. So it's always wonderful when we have people's family members joining the conference. So today is no different. So we've got Aileen's brother dialing in and helping us. We've got Priscilla, who sent us through a recording. Priscilla is based in Colorado at the Colorado School of Mines, but she's currently traveling. So she's in the middle of nowhere and she sent in a recording. We've got Grace. Grace, where are you dialing in from?
An exceptionally sunny London morning, as you can probably see on the side of my face.
That pesky ball of gas in the sky.
Yes.
Yeah, so Grace is dialing in from London. Milena is dialing in from.
Also from a very sunny Barcelona.
So, there we go. See, it's not too bad, is it? And finally, but by no means least, we've got the lovely Rini. And Rini is dialing in from, I'm going to take a guess here. Are you dialing in from Australia, Rini?
Yes, correct. Down under Canberra, Australia, the land of the kangaroo.
Excellent. So Rini is dialing in from the land of the kangaroo, and that is a claim that none of the rest of us can make here today. But I'm really excited that Rini is joining us. So Rini, if you want to start sharing your slides now. Rini, I met Rini a number of years ago when we were in the process of setting up a big new research centre called the Rio Tinto Centre for Future Materials. And Rini is one of the most amazing social scientists you will ever meet, in part because she can actually speak to engineers and other forms of scientists, which is a rare skill. And Rini has been amazing because she's not only taught me a huge amount, but she certainly shaped a lot of the broader research that's going on within the group, hence the reason for inviting Rini to come and speak to us today. So with that, please put your hands together for the fantastic Rini. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. So, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So, I want to open with two numbers that sit side by side on this slide, because together they frame the argument that I'll be making. So, the Democratic Republic of Congo supplies roughly 70% of the world's cobalt, and that is well known. But how much of the value does it capture? Yeah, the mineral that goes into almost every lithium-ion battery that powering the electric vehicles that we are counting so much on our decarbonization strategy is actually just provide 3% of value to Democratic Republic of Congo. This is according to a 2021 study by Bloomberg and the United Nations Economic Commissions for Africa. And alongside that figure, on my right side here, globally, there are 767 active socio-environmental conflicts globally that currently recorded by the Global Environmental Justice Atlas. This directly linked to mineral extraction and mining of building materials like sands and others. And these are not historical conflicts. These are ongoing and rising as global demand for critical mineral accelerates. So these two numbers describe the same problem from two directions. One shows where the value goes. The other shows what gets left behind when it does. So today my talk is about values. And my talk is going to be about whether the governance of critical minerals is capable of changing that relationship. That is to deliver an energy transition that is not only clean, but genuinely fair. So to understand why those two numbers exist side by side, we need to look at what kinds of values are actually present at the mine site and what the current system does with them. And this is, I think, my argument here is that these diverse values underpin the certainty that we need in supplying critical minerals for energy transition. So these three values that I show here on the slides are coming from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. They give us a useful framework here to differentiate between diverse values. So the first category is instrumental values. These are the economic contributions, resource asset, ecosystem services, income generation, such as royalties, that are currently dominant in mining decisions through cost-benefit analysis. And these are the values that mining governance already recognizes, at least on paper. And all of these are just some mechanisms for capturing instrumental values. But even here, recognition is narrow. The system tends to count what is easy to monetize and quietly ignores what is not. And this is the first problem that we try to capture here in the research that I'm leading, that Sarah mentioned about the Rio Tinto Center for Future Materials. And then the second category is about relational values. And this is where current governance starts to break down significantly. Relational values are about the meaningfulness of relationship between people and land, between communities and place, sense of belonging, cultural identity, livelihoods that are bound up with specific landscapes and others. And the last one, or the third category, is intrinsic values. The idea that nature has a right to exist independently of what it provides to humans. An example that often being mentioned is how the communities in Peru, it's called Quechua, maybe I'm mistaken how I pronunciate that, but these communities understand the Ausangate mountain there not as a geographical feature, but as a powerful living earth being with its own standing in the world. And this kind of value is not just overlooked. It is structurally excluded from virtually every governance instrument that we currently have in the mining sector. So we have one category recognized but captured narrowly, that is the instrumental values. One frequently overlooked, which is the relational values, and one systematically excluded, which are the intrinsic values. That gradient, they're not accidental. It reflects whose worldviews constructed the governance system in the first place. So this brings me to the core structural argument that I would like to make in this presentation. So the problem here is not only that these values exist and are ignored. The problem is that the governance architectures that currently we have on materials give them no pathway to travel between the production side into the consumption side. So what I want to, in this slide, what I think is the most important and the most under-examined claim in the governance of critical mineral is that the governance of critical mineral is currently very fragmented across its life cycle. There is the exploration, extraction, processing, manufacturing, consumption, etc., circularity. And each stage has its own instrument, its own actors, its own logic, basically its own systems. And they do not speak to each other about values, and especially about all of this diversity of values. The result is a structural asymmetry. So on the production side, the mine side, we have the mine, the community, the territory, and we actually have quite reasonable developed vocabularies and toolbox, if we want to say it's toolbox. There is the free, prior, and informed consent, social license to operate, cultural heritage protections, and others. And these concepts are heavily theorized. I'm an academic, so I like to talk about theories. So there are decades of research and legal frameworks and community advocacy built around them. The problem is not that we lack the language. The problem is that these values have no institutional pathway to downstream sector, to the people and organizations making decisions about consumption. And on the consumption side, the original equipment manufacturer, the investor, the consumers, the regulators, the value language is completely different. It is about brand reputation, it's about ESG ratings, it's about credentials. And these are not equivalent categories to production side of the values. So the production side values I just described here are already heavily theorized and have substantial advocacy behind them. However, the consumption side framing is largely under-theorized. It is about consumer preference, it's about compliance signaling, and sometimes it's about geopolitics. So here is my crucial, currently kind of like hypothesis. While production side values have no institutional pathway downstream, consumption side values do travel upstream. These ESG ratings, procurement requirements, and due diligence standards do reach mining companies. But when they arrive, they do not carry or reflect the values of the communities most affected by this production of or extraction of critical materials. They carry the values of the companies and investors or customers who design the metrics. So we have a one-way flow, and it runs in the wrong directions, especially for the communities bearing the cost of critical mineral extractions and processing. And this asymmetry is precisely what my current research project is trying to name and theorize. We are developing the concept of value laundering. It's coming from money laundering, to describe the structural processes by which consumer side compliance signals like ESG ratings or battery passport, if it's about, EV batteries, travel upstream through aggregation layers that strip them of any connection to the specific values affecting communities. The signal arrives at the mine as a binary. It's about compliant or non-compliant. And it has been laundered of its provenance. And this is not just easily a metaphor that we take it for granted. I think it is about a governance mechanism that we need to address. So I would like to stop here by saying that, so what needs to change? This presentation today is kind of like a beginning of our 3 years project about values in critical mineral supply chains. And I want to be careful here about what I am and I'm not claiming. I have argued that there is a structural asymmetry in how values are recognized across the critical minerals life cycle. I have suggested that the mechanism producing this asymmetry can be named and theorized, and currently we name it as value laundering. But I'm not going to tell you that I have a ready-made governance solution, because we are just starting this year, and we hope by the end of the 3 years that we will be able to offer that governance solutions to this asymmetry in values. So what I want to answer here is that who is responsible for building this governance solution? So to answer this is that everyone in this room, and of course every stakeholder will have different ways of contributing to this governance solutions. For example, for me, academics and as a researcher, I can build the evidence base to understand more about how the communities can co-produce the kind of value feedback or value flows mechanisms that will look more symmetrical from the production side to the consumption side. For policymakers, by redesigning instruments that currently, addressing these dangers of value laundering. And for industry, is by treating, free prior informed consent mechanism and community engagement as genuine obligation, not just as a performance, especially not just as, compliance or non-compliance to respond to ESG metrics. So the energy transition will happen. The question is whether the communities bearing its costs will have any meaningful say in how. And by acknowledging and recognizing these value asymmetries between the production side and consumption side, we start to think about how can we reform these governance mechanisms and acknowledging these plural values to ensure certainty in critical mineral supply chain. I think that's it. Thank you, Sarah.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rini. Round of applause. Absolutely brilliant. First question. Those 3 types of value that you shared with us, was it instrumental, relational, and intrinsic? Do you feel that the majority of people even begin to comprehend what is meant by the relational and the intrinsic values?
Yeah.
Is it, or how do you get people to actually understand what you're meaning there?
Yeah, I guess I can give an example. The one that is so famous, it happened in, 2020. It was the blowing up of the Juukan Gorge cave in Australia, a place that is so sacred for the First Nations community in Western Australia, that was blown up despite the protections that happened and all of the legal instruments that supposedly prevent that to happen. So that relationship between the First Nations community to their place, to their significant cultural place like Juukan Gorge is what we meant by that relational values. So that moment of trust crisis, I guess, between the mining companies and the community was widely, featured in the news, and that I think signaling that the public start to understand it's not all about royalties. There are also another aspect of values that we need to recognize, which is about that relationship with nature, with land, with biodiversities that are also important.
Yeah, no, I think it's something, and Juukan Gorge is it was absolutely terrible what happened there, but is such a good case study to try and explore and begin to in a very tangible way explore different types of value that come through with that. And then secondly, in terms of your value laundering, which I think is such an awesome term to explore, not least because it's so emotive. It's brilliant.
Well, this is something that, it's just based on discussion between us researchers that are in the project.
Yeah.
It's not yet, based on evidence that, it's just the start of our research. So we cannot say anything significant yet about that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, but I think, hey, look, it's a really good way to get people to engage with you, isn't it? The clickbait's value in that term.
Yeah.
And I think just with that as well, so having worked in different aspects of the sector for many years, I think what I really like in terms of what you're portraying is it almost feels like there's a one-way relationship where the people who are the consumers turn around and say, right, you lot need to be responsible, you need to do things properly, etc. But in return, we're still not really seeing, well, what's the reward in terms of doing things properly? And I say that just through the instrumental value lens.
Yeah.
But then when you go deeper into the other forms of value, in terms of the consumers, do you think they even begin to comprehend what this looks like at the beginning of the value chain?
Definitely. Yes, that is definitely the argument here.
Yeah.
Companies respond to the consumer's preference by sometimes simply, tick box exercises, and we want it to be more than that. That the consumer side's awareness about these diverse values start to inform their behavioral consumerism as well, because there is an article talking about mostly people in the US who use the EV, who adopt EVs. They don't, like many of them, they don't have awareness about the impacts of, securing critical minerals for the creations of EVs, for example. So there's two ways dialogues here, definitely. But currently what we see is that consumer preference is really what drives companies' behaviors, not yet from the community side.
Yeah, no, exactly. There are a number of questions coming in the chat, but picking one of them, almost at random, comes in from Mark, and Mark is asking. They say we understand you're at the beginning of the research, but do you have any thoughts or hypotheses on what might be the incentives or levers that could improve the pathway from the production side to the consumption side?
Oh, that is a really hard question.
He's asking you for the answers already.
Yes. Well, Mark, we do talk about leverage points in our research, and we try to start identifying some of the governance mechanisms that are existing. For example, the EU CDD, I think due diligence mechanisms, for example. We try to start having like an analysis about how this existing governance mechanism in the EU, for example, can be like improved. And then the IRMA version 2, I guess. And also, so we talk about leverage point, basically ways to find the loopholes to address to make values more visible, basically. And acknowledging the value tensions here between the consumer sides and, the consumption side and the production side. So first, of course, acknowledging the value tensions, and then adopting these diverse values in the governance mechanisms, in which we try now to start kind of like identifying which governance mechanism will be really helpful. So we are in that stage of the research currently, identifying which one. So for example, the IRMA version 2, and then the EU, I forgot but due diligence mechanisms. Yeah, I need to find it again. Yeah, that's the leverage point is what I meant here.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Rini. And yes, another clickbait term you used there was that value tensions. I think as well describes it so well. So with that, thank you so much, Rini. We really value you coming here today to speak with us. Thank you so much. Good luck with the research. Round of applause. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Rini. That was great. Next up, so we're going all the way from Australia to Barcelona, and we're going to welcome Milena to our virtual stage. And Milena is doing her research actually through University College Dublin at ICRAG, which is very confusing because Dublin is not in Spain, last time I checked. But I'm going to hand it over to you. So we've gone from a social scientist, and now we're going to hear from somebody who likes rocks. Milena, over to yourself.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks a lot. And first of all, I want to thank the organizing committee of the conference for inviting me to talk a little bit about geology. So the aim of this talk would be to take you on a brief journey through the cobalt geology in the Copper Belt, which I think that the previous talk already sets the ground really well to talk about the DRC. Rini has already mentioned the cobalt in the DRC, but hopefully we will have a look at it through a geological lens, which I think is just as important as the geopolitical and the supply chain perspective. So to start off, I want to start by reflecting on the topic of the conference, which is creating certainty in a world of change. And the question I want to pose here is, how are geology and society linked? And I think that geologists are eventually the scientists that are the most linked to society, because almost everything that we use nowadays, at least technology-wise, is manufactured with materials that come from the planet beneath our feet. And geologists are the ones who know, hopefully, who know the most about the planet beneath our feet and what's hidden and what's buried under it. So. But how does a geologist work normally? And in my case, how does an ore geochemist work? So our work involves the study of rocks and minerals that have economic and social value through the means of, first of all, fieldwork and sampling. So here's where we collect our samples. Then we perform a very detailed study and characterization of its petrography. So how do these rocks look like? How do the minerals look like? And many other characteristics that we can find and we can observe in these rocks. And then we can analyze these rocks and these minerals through means of geochemical analysis. And then we can combine all this data to produce genetic models, which are basically which aim to improve the exploration. So hopefully those genetic models of how these big mineral systems work can be applied to enhance the discovery rate of mineral deposits. So basically, I think that geologists, what we do is to create certainty in the mineral deposit formation to improve both academic and industry knowledge. So now let's delve into the cobalt. So cobalt, as many of us are aware of, is a critical metal that is used for rechargeable batteries for electric vehicles, mainly, among many other important usages. And because these technologies are very important for the transition of our society towards greener energies, we can say that we need a stable supply of this cobalt. But if we look at the cobalt production worldwide, we can see that more than 75% of the cobalt, like Rini mentioned earlier, it comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we can see that the cobalt production and prices are very much influenced by conflicts and events happening in the DRC. And this can be observed in this graph here. So I've plotted the world mine production of cobalt in blue, and then we have the cobalt price in orange. And one of the first things that we can see is that after the year 2000, we can see a very steady increase in the cobalt mine production, probably because of the use of cobalt in the manufacture of rechargeable batteries. But we can also see that there is a decrease in cobalt production, but also an increase in the cobalt price associated with several DRC-related events and conflicts. So I think that most people probably in this conference will be very aware of the geopolitics of the DRC cobalt. But I think that there's still little known on the geoscience behind it and on why is the DRC the world leading producer of cobalt. And this is where geology comes in. And I'm going to start by explaining one of the most basic concepts, which is what is an ore deposit. And basically, an ore deposit is a natural concentration of an economic metal or mineral. And this accumulation, it is not random. So it happened because all the ingredients that we need to form a mineral deposit were met. And here I like to make an analogy with baking. So if you want to bake a cake, you need a specific set of ingredients like flour, eggs, sugar, etc. But you also need a very specific oven with very specific temperature and very specific time. Otherwise, your cake won't look like a cake. So the very same happens with cobalt deposits. So we need a very specific geologic context and very specific ingredients to form this. And eventually all these geological processes shape the distribution of cobalt in the earth. So yeah, we can see that cobalt deposits, they are associated with copper deposits and with nickel deposits. And these are the three main types: sediment-hosted copper cobalt. Then we have magmatic sulfide nickel copper deposits. We have laterite nickel cobalt deposits. But for now, I'm going to focus on sediment-hosted copper cobalt deposits. And these are, so as we can see in this map here, most of the cobalt resources from this specific type of deposit, they come from the DRC. So all the cobalt that we know that is produced in the DRC actually is hosted within this specific type of deposit that has a very specific set of characteristics. And this type of deposits is actually correlated with a specific geologic setting, which we call continental rift, which happens when continents internally, they start splitting. And a good analog for this would be the Eastern African rift that's happening nowadays. Cool. So there's also other types of cobalt-rich deposits, and I would like to redirect you to Richard Harrington's talk on diversifying cobalt supplies. And he gave this talk during the first version of the Responsible Raw Materials Conference in 2020. So if you're interested in that, I would like to redirect you there. Here's a QR code. But for now, let's focus on the Central African Copper Belt. So as the name says, this metallogenic province, it occurs within Central Africa, and it straddles the Democratic Republic of Congo and the Zambia political border. So to the north here we have the DRC, and to the south we have Zambia. So each of these whitish or creamish dots that we can see in this satellite image corresponds to a mine where it has either been in production or it's being produced, or extraction is happening at the moment of both copper and or cobalt. And this belt, as we can see, it extends for approximately 400 kilometers. So it is a very, very large metallogenic belt. And we can see that each of these whitish creamish dots, they correspond with the location of a mineral deposit. And as we can see from the overlap of these bubbles here. So each of these bubbles represents a specific mineral deposit. And the size of the bubbles represents the tonnage, so how much metal is contained within the mineral deposit. And the blue shade represents the cobalt grade, and the red shade corresponds to the copper grade. So these are copper-cobalt deposits, but we can see that there is a difference in the ratio of copper to cobalt from the Zambia side to the DRC side. So we can see that most of the dark blue shades within the bubbles are hosted in the DRC, whereas the bubbles in the Zambian side, they are generally with lighter shades of blue, which means that they are poor in cobalt, with the exception of a few deposits on the western side of the Zambian copper belt. So some names, I'm going to just name some mines in case they ring a bell to you. So some of these cobalt-rich deposits in Zambia are the Chambishi district deposits, and within the DRC side, we have the Tenke-Fungurume district, we have the Kambove district, and we have other deposits such as the Mutanda deposit. So we can also take the cobalt and the copper tonnages of these of all these mineral deposits, and something that's quite striking is that even though cobalt is associated with copper in the larger scale, when we plot cobalt and copper in a scatter plot, we can see that they are not necessarily correlated. So that means that having a high copper tonnage doesn't imply that you will have a high cobalt tonnage as well. And this tells us a lot about the different conditions that we need to form copper-rich deposits versus cobalt-rich mineral deposits. So this is all when it comes to the distribution of cobalt in the surface, but then we can also have a look at this through depth. And for this, we can draw a cross-section, which is basically a slice of the copper belt, to see how does the copper belt look in depth. And this is a very, very simplified sketch of the structure of the copper belt. Like Sarah said, we geologists, we think we know how things look like. This is how we think it looks like. So it's, I'm going to make another analogy here. So we basically have, we see that the rocks in the copper belts, they are like a layered cake. So we have a basement, which we could talk about it as a plate, where then a sequence of rocks, what we call sedimentary rocks, are stacked upon it or are overlying this plate. And we can see that actually cobalt within all these different layers of the cake, the cobalt is not randomly distributed. It's actually associated with specific types or specific layers. So this can be observed here. So I plotted more or less how much cobalt or what is the cobalt tonnage hosted by each of these different layers of the cake. And we can see that most of it, it's associated with this layer here, which contains abundant evaporitic units, which is a specific type of rock. And most of the cobalt is hosted by a type of rock that we call dolomitic shale. In some cases, it's more like dolostones, but in some cases, more siltstones or shales. But they are all generally called dolomitic shales. Cool, but how does the cobalt ore look like in the Central African copper belt? So we have two main types of ore. The first one is called primary ore, which is carolite. Which it forms underground, so deep in the earth, and it's a copper cobalt sulfide. And then when this ore is exposed to the surface, then it's weathered and oxidized, and it produces this secondary ore, which we call heterogenite, which is a cobalt oxyhydroxide. So this is what we see at the surface of the copper belt deposits. But when it comes to the primary ore, which is the one that I'm interested in because it's the primary concentration of cobalt, we see that the rocks look somehow like this. So these are some of the rocks that I'm working with. So it's this grayish, greenish rocks that are laminated. We can see that there's some layers as well. And this grayish, silverish specks, that's the carolite, which is the copper cobalt sulfide. So here is the zoom in. So these are the corallite grains where the cobalt is concentrated. And then the rest is just dolomitic shale, which doesn't necessarily need to be enriched in cobalt at all. So let's try to wrap up the geology for now. So some of the first things that we've seen is that cobalt deposits, they are not randomly distributed. Either they occur, but they occur in specific geologic settings. And in this case, the DRC deposits, they occur within intraplate rifting geologic settings. And then if we have a look specifically at the Central African copper belt deposits, we can see that these are associated with specific stratigraphic units or layers. So once again, this is not randomly distributed. Something else that we've seen as well is that cobalt is generally decoupled from copper at the deposit scale, even though, as we may already know, cobalt is produced as a byproduct of copper. And then finally, we've seen that there's two types of cobalt ore. The first one is the primary ore, which is a sulfide, and then we have the cobalt oxyhydroxide, which is basically this sulfide that has been weathered and oxidized. And I think that partially because of this exposure to the surface of the ore, this geological processes has made the copper belt deposits more easily mineable, which has an impact in the supply chain of cobalt, basically, and the cobalt extraction in this region. And I'm gonna finish by making some final reflections on the cobalt geology and society, of course. So yes, we have seen the geology controls where cobalt forms and whether it can be more easily mined or less easily mined. So geology shapes the distribution of cobalt deposits. This distribution is not random. And this brings up a big question, which is whether the Central African copper belt in the DRC is a unique place in the world. And I think that in order to answer this question, we need many more geologists who understand geology and how critical metal deposits form. Because I think that finding this mineral deposit is not a matter of luck. It requires a lot of knowledge, curiosity, and many trained geologists. And this is why geology education and outreach matter a lot nowadays, and even more nowadays more than ever, because geology is a science that is neglected in most sectors. So yeah, ultimately geology defines the resources, location, geologists find these resources, and then society decides how to use the resources. And this raises important questions about responsible cobalt production, especially in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo. And this leads into my final slide, in which I want to show you a small piece of a text that was produced after a project led by ICRAC and the Irish Writers' Centre, where science met storytelling. So basically, a writer that I collaborated with named Dee, she reimagined what responsible cobalt mining could look like, inspired by my research on cobalt in the copper belt. So I'm just going to read a short excerpt where it talks about a world where phones are not built in factories, but in the old ways, so lovingly and handmade by artists. And then it reflects about the critical metals in the phone. So the text goes like this. All parts interchangeable and replaceable, except of course for the critical metals, the trace elements at the battery's core. This you or the artist have sourced in one of two ways, ideally recycled from a pre-existing device, perhaps handed down by a family member, or else consciously and conscientiously mined. Perhaps you chose your cobalt of origin, chose the mine you wish to work with, and then arranged the slot for extraction under the guidance of a skilled, experienced local miner. And this is all from my side. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and if you have any questions, I'll be open to answering them. Thank you.
Milena, truly, truly brilliant. Thank you so, so much for that. And I think on behalf of all of us, thank you for not only making the geology really interesting, but very understandable as well. I think, your pictures of the rocks and saying, well, no, it's in that mineral there, that's where we find the cobalt, etc. Because so often I think as geologists we forget to do that when we're speaking to everyone. So thank you with regards to that. And the poem that you read, or the extract that you read at the end, so can you tell us a bit more about where that came from and what, what's the story behind it?
Yeah, so this was a very, very exciting project. And I think Dee was really interested on the geopolitical side of cobalt, of course. And I think when we started having conversations, I was telling her about the geology of cobalt, but in the end, she was more drawn towards the geopolitics. I think her as a writer, she was moved by all the conflicts happening in the DRC, all the child labor and the artisanal mining and the poor working conditions. So she just we just had this conversation about how would responsible artisanal mining look like, or how would like an idealized world look like if we were to source cobalt and critical metals in a responsible way. And then she thought, oh, maybe we can actually be the ones who go and source these metals, so we can be trained by geologists or by local miners about how to obtain these metals, instead of like being completely dissociated from the mining sector and just letting the mining happen in other countries. So I think it was like a way for her to concealing and bringing together I don't know, like her ideas for like an idealized world and how responsible mining could look like maybe at some point in the future. Yeah, that's it.
And I think it's great because it's, and coming back to what Rini was saying earlier, where we've got, we know that we have different sort of types of value, but I think we find it so difficult to communicate what those actually are and what it really means to us. And so your relationship with Dee there, and in terms of the writing, you can begin to pull on those strands and on those threads of like what's really important to them. So no, that's brilliant. Thank you for that. Now, I've got loads of questions, but Jan Henk has put a great question into the chat, and Jan Henk is asking, what and where do you think is the source of the cobalt in the copper belt, and could that be an indication to its distribution? Now, Jan Henk, that is a horrible question, because if we knew the answer to it,
so actually,
on you go, Milena.
It's a very geology-focused question. I'm not sure if the public wants to hear this, but actually, I've just been working on a paper on this. I think the problem is that we don't really know what the source is, so we can only speculate about it. There's many papers that say, oh, maybe there's specific rocks, like in the basement, like I said, the plate of the copper belt, and maybe there's some mafic rocks that have high cobalt. But then if you look at all the other deposits, cobalt-rich deposits in the world, they are generally associated with specific type of rock, which are ultramafic rocks. And these rocks have really high cobalt inherently. They are not concentrated by mineralizing processes. They are just inherently high in cobalt. So I think there may be a link between these ultramafic rocks and the cobalt in the copper belt, but we don't really see occurrences of ultramafic rocks in the copper belt, at least in the surface. So yeah, exactly. So they are either buried, or we just had a very, very efficient mechanism to leach cobalt from whatever rock we had there. So this could be like a very saline fluid that can extract very efficiently all the cobalt, regardless of what the rock is there. So there's two hypotheses here. We either have very cobalt-rich rocks buried somewhere, or or then we just have a very efficient mechanism to extract and leach the cobalt from whatever rocks we have.
Great, thank you very much, Milena. And I know that the conversation with regards to this is going to continue in the chat. And also, for anybody out there who's thinking, what on earth is a mafic rock, an ultramafic rock? Yeah. I know that Aileen is quietly tapping into the chat a cheat sheet with regards to this, so it's all good. Final question,
Thanks,
Milena.
Aileen.
So you made the most amazing call there, which is we need more geologists. I could not agree with you more. I think that is probably the most fundamental thing that has been said in this conference all week. But with regards to those geologists and thinking about the copper belt, where do you think those geologists should come from?
I mean, so I am Spanish. I am from Barcelona. So I would like to work in Spain. I would like to work in the geology of Spain. So that's the way I see it. I feel like that if you feel like you're from a specific country and you would like to develop the geology and the mining industry in that country, then that's how I feel. So for example, for the copper belt deposits, I feel like that we should have more Congolese geologists working and knowing what they're doing. But I think that there's already a lot of Congolese geologists working on that. So we just need to acknowledge that, like, it's also part of their industry and it's also part of their economy. It's just that perhaps it's not handled or arranged and managed in the most efficient and responsible way. But yeah, we just need to empower them, basically. And they need to empower themselves. I think they are already empowered, but but yeah, I think I think Congolese geologists, but anywhere in the world, I think anywhere will be fine. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Milena. Great answer. So with that,
Thanks, Sarah.
please, everyone, put your hands together for the fabulous Milena. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was great. Fantastic. Okay, next up, we have, I'm gonna call you a veteran, Grace, but in the nicest possible way, because this is not your first time speaking at Responsible Raw Materials. So thank you very, very much for coming back to be with us here today. I'm really lucky in that Grace and I get to bump into one another at many, many conferences and events around the world, which is truly wonderful, because I always know that we're going to have a great conversation. There's always going to be fantastic insight. And Grace, thank you for being one of those people at all those conferences around the world where I can truly be myself with. So yes, thank you for providing the safe space for a proper conversation wherever we might be. So with that, please put your hands together for the fabulous Grace. Over to you.
Wow, what a kind introduction, Sarah. Thank you so much. I don't know where I can go from there, really. I'll just start by introducing myself, I guess. I'm Grace Youngworth. I'm a director of mining, mine water, and sustainability at WSP Mining and Metals. I'm really happy to be here today presenting on future-proofing the bottom line, talking about building resilience through resource stewardship. I'll just double check you can see my screen okay. Yes, great. Fantastic. So a quick look at the agenda. I'll take you through the concept of resource stewardship and some examples on how it can be practically applied to increase resilience, tying to the theme of the conference through the mining life cycle. So I'm here today to discuss how resource stewardship enables project resilience. And as most people would understand, the key to success for most mining and metals projects is smooth, uninterrupted production, followed by efficient transition through to closure. And so most mining projects are not stopped by geology alone. They are often interrupted through unmanaged resource, social, environmental, or delivery risks. In the world today, I think it's fair to see, and it's really visible for most people now, that competition for resources such as water, excuse me, energy, carbon, land, and nature is just increasing, and it's only going to increase. And these resources are also the same resources that underpin stable production and social license. So really what we've seen as a shift in the industry is that sustainability and resource stewardship has moved beyond reporting, and it's become core business embedded in mainstream decision-making for most miners. And we're talking about data-led approaches to target setting as an imperative. And really my take-home message is that proactive stewardship is essential to secure reliable long-term access to these resources, which then allows you to maintain production and reduce legacy liability and sustain value creation. So my background is in mine water, and you'll probably see that come through in some of the images that are on the screen, but I've chosen here as well to first talk about water stewardship. So I'll introduce this concept quickly. Water stewardship's been around for a long time, but those who aren't aware, the definition is the use of water in ways that are socially equitable, environmentally sustainable, and economically beneficial. And when I think about this, I always think of beyond the fence line. It's a nice image to help you think about use of water for all the users in the catchment equitably. And really, when you're thinking about this, you're talking about forward-looking water strategies that integrate climate variability, cumulative impacts in the catchment, and considers project and portfolio decisions. What we've learned over the last while as an industry is that one-size-fits-all targets are really not effective. You can imagine if you have a corporate water stewardship strategy and then you have a diverse portfolio of projects across different hydrological or operational contexts, their needs for water stewardship are going to be very different. Different mines use different amounts of water. They might be in arid regions. They might be in non-arid regions. It's just not one size fits all at all. So really what you need are regional and operation specific targets that align to your material project risks. And this is pulling in some of the thoughts that Rainey actually already mentioned earlier. So thank you for that. Which reduces the chance that your production will be stopped either by lack of or too much water or social license restrictions. So in practice, how is this achieved? And I'd like to share one example on the next slide of a major miner's water strategy, which was recently made available publicly, and it's a good example. So this is Anglo American's water stewardship strategy, and it really is a great example of a portfolio-led approach to water stewardship. And you can see that they've done a great job in the image there on the left of integrating site water management with catchment-based management with collective action from all water users, integrating stakeholder dialogue. And their targets then are translated into very business-specific targets aligned with the local water priorities in both water scarce and non-water scarce regions. So I'll first start talking about those targets in the orange box, which is the water scarce regions. So if you look at Anglo's operations in Chile, their focus there is on zero freshwater extraction, which is important to the local communities that also use that resource. If you look at Kumba Iron Ore, the focus is on ecosystem resilience and equitable water access and using tools like things like groundwater recharge to resupply the communities and the ecosystems. If you think about Peru, the focus is on water security and access. So you'll see that even in what might be considered similar environments or all water scarce, the focus it changes depending on the stakeholder needs, which is great practice. Then if you go up to the blue box, which is Brazil, operations in Brazil, this is a non-arid environment where water is available in the basin, but it has high rainfall variability and periodic drought conditions. And they've really addressed water quality pressures in this environment where you're looking at protection of watersheds and operational systems to manage the physical risk of this high rainfall and periodic drought conditions. So I don't actually work for Anglo American, but they are one of our clients, and I will just say my own personal opinion is this is not from Anglo, that this is a great example of aligning their water stewardship strategy with the material risks of each portfolio, which has helped them build resilience for their operations. Now, you might ask, is there a role for policy in driving resource stewardship approach? And I would say, of course, there is. The leaders in this space are generally water scarce regions, although there's others because there's policy from overarching bodies like ICMM. But we'll just look quickly at what South Africa is doing as an example first. So in South Africa, the policy has been driven by the Department of Water and Sanitation, the Water Research Commission, the Minerals Council of South Africa, and their partners, including companies like ours, WSP, and others. And what they've done here is they've set up several different mechanisms to support the industry. So at a national level, they have a really transparent process set out in the operational rules for water supply to allocate catchment level resources. And so this involves the technical pieces like modeling and planning, and then they allocate the water to stakeholders based on a really transparent process. And they also have things like action plans put in place to help, excuse me, improve water supply and efficiency amongst their users. Then they also have another industry support tool, which is, it's a mouthful, the Water Conservation Water Demand Management Tool, which allows operators to understand their awareness, to support benchmarking, and to understand where they are in terms of progress. And this has been really effective in South Africa. There's some references there to the appropriate places at the bottom of the screen if you want to learn more about that. And next, I'll just have to credit some of my colleagues for studying and sharing their learnings on the implementation of this tool, which I'll talk about on this next slide. And really here, the message is that it's operators that engage and drive these tools. And when they do that, it leads to really positive outcomes like ensuring accurate representation of water supply systems. So all the stakeholders are aware of their water supply and demand position. And then the mining industry, in turn, has a systematic approach to managing their water supply and demand with a continuous feedback loop to help conditions improve. And the key takeaway when looking at this implementation is that you cannot future-proof mining operations and resource requirements without proactive multi-stakeholder engagement and improved measurement and modeling. And again, I think this aligns as well with some of the previous talks, which is great to see. So this is a great example of where policy-led positive resource stewardship outcomes are based on good technical practice and this stakeholder engagement. So lastly, I would have to say, if you're trying to future-proof your producing asset, you really should be considering the entire asset lifecycle, including integrated mine closure. From the ICMM Good Practice Guide, this involves dynamic and iterative processes that considers all of these necessary parameters like environmental, social, and economic factors from early stage in mine development through the life of an asset. So this is really viewing mine closure as an integrated part of mine operations core business and embedding the objectives early so that you can actually really make a difference in design elements instead of retrofitting closure solutions at the end of the mine life. And what this does is allows the cost to run during operational phases and for operators to avoid legacy liabilities. And given that my mine closure colleagues tell me that about 70% of mines close unexpectedly, which is an interesting statistic, managing this risk and cost is essential to running a resilient operation. And the next slide, I'll present a positive example of how this can be done. Okay, so on this slide, we're presenting an example of progressive mine closure at Ada Tepe Gold Mine in Bulgaria, which is run by DPM Metals. And you can see there, there's a mine waste facility. I'm not sure if you can see my pointer, but there's two V valleys, and these are the fronts of the mine waste facilities that look like a V on the screen if you couldn't see my pointer there. And they are being progressively rehabilitated as the facility is being built up and as production is running. And this aligns with the ICMM integrated mine closure practice, which emphasizes this closure planning from early stages. And it also has a direct benefit to water, carbon, nature, biodiversity, stakeholders, and the balance sheet, which is an important one. And now, I have to say again, focusing on water, because that's my preference, is that there was a really fantastic quote by one of the attendees of the PASTE conference in Portugal earlier this month, Sonia Finucane, who said, "Water outlasts all other closure challenges," and I couldn't agree more. But I know I'm slightly biased there, and this is really a good example as well of early design decisions, reducing the long-term water treatment risks, enhancing stability, and reducing the post-closure liabilities just by integrating that thought process in the design. You can also see that this approach would reduce the need to rehandle materials, which also helps you align on reduced energy needs and allows for early reclamation of the land and nature, leaving less environmental and financial risk for post-closure activities. So you can imagine if this mine just happened to be one of that 70% that closed unexpectedly, the liability would be significantly mitigated by the approach they've taken here. So on to my closing slide. Hopefully I've managed to convince you or even demonstrate technically that there's an increasing business advantage and resilience when you plan mining responsibly to use less energy, water, and natural resources to do so. And that always involves positively integrating environment and communities from the project startup through the whole asset life cycle to closure. By managing these risks, you help protect your license to operate, you have operational continuity, so less likely of production disruption, and increased long-term value. This also strengthens stakeholder certainty for all your stakeholders and involves setting and delivering on meaningful portfolio-specific, that's an important one, targets that help mining companies meet their commitments, also help them building stronger, more resilient businesses ready to thrive in this uncertain world. There's a good quote there. And with that, I'll say thank you all for your attention.
Grace, as always, thank you so much. Everyone, round of applause for the fantastic Grace Youngworth. That's brilliant. Grace, as always, there are lots of fantastic comments and questions coming in. And also we've had a number of other talks already this week that have focused on the topic of water. You'll be delighted to hear. My first question, though, is around, so you described what the companies can do, especially with regards to that more specific setting of targets and that portfolio approach, and then also what governments can do from a policy perspective. But thinking about who actually triggers that improvement or that change? Is it often the companies? Is it the governments? Is it communities? Is it the investors? Who often pushes for these changes that we often know we need to make?
So that's a fantastic question. And I think the reality here is that the environment is changing. I think over the past while, it's been stakeholders like investors and governments. But actually, I would argue, from my experience, is that, as I said, most mining companies now understand that there's a real business advantage here. And they've pushed these considerations into their risk management, their core business planning. They might not be calling it ESG or sustainability at the moment because of the political climate, but they're doing it. They are absolutely doing it as a matter of, a business necessity.
And
I'm not sure, I'm sort of saying the entire industry is there, but that's the trend. That's the trend we're seeing.
So with that, and Lucy's got a great question in the chat that follows on from that. And she's saying, well, it sounds like some of the majors are doing really well. You gave the example from Anglo American, and I used to work there, as you know. So I was like, well done, Grace, excellent. But I remember, to your point, when I was living and working in Brazil, which was awesome, we would have to shut down the entire operation because we'd run out of water. And we had all the rights to extract the water, but because somebody else was mining nearby, they were drawing down the water table, etc. So lots and lots of conversations, lots of quite early days climate modeling to try and understand what might be happening in terms of precipitation levels, all of that kind of stuff. But that's what Anglo could do at the time. And I'm not saying that Anglo is the best company in the world. There are lots of problems. But what about the smaller sized producers? Are they able to do this? Are they better? Are they worse? Or are they just different depending on where they are around the world?
Yeah, so also a really good question. So what I'd say over my career working in mine water, at the beginning, I definitely had to sell to mine operators the value of effective and proactive water management. It was something that was seen as a cost that was unnecessary, maybe a nice to have. And again, it's just so encouraging and positive now that, again, businesses understand that if you don't get water right, your production stops.
Mm-hmm.
And there's lots of good examples of this, and that materially affects their bottom line.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think this is just a major thing. This is not a nice to have in the industry. And the one example that I did present from DPM Metals, I mean, they're mid-tier seam. I think, okay, they're a little more mature as well. But we're seeing a lot of our junior miners as well very interested in making sure that they're managing their water risk proactively. Now, sometimes there's still a little bit of sales involved or explanation to understand why, but I think the industry as a whole has really matured in this space. And that's incredibly encouraging for me to see as a practitioner. And the science has moved along as well in terms of what you can predict and what you can do, and just the understanding that that whole catchment, that stewardship approach is so essential. Because as you say, it might not be something you're doing, it might be something your neighbor's doing that can then affect your operations and your cash flow.
Yeah, no, brilliant. Now, Grace, there are more questions coming in the chat, but I'll let you address them in writing. But everyone, please put your hands together for the fantastic Grace. Absolutely brilliant. Cheers, mate.
Thanks a lot to everyone.
Brilliant. Okay, so next up, we have a lady who is so good, she's not even here. But it's okay because she sent us through a pre-recording or a recording of her talk. And this individual is the one and only Professor Priscilla Nelson. Now, if you want to speak to somebody who really knows their stuff about tailings dams and waste management, Grace was already talking about it. She showed some fantastic pictures of waste dumps, etc. My phone a friend is Priscilla. Now, also as well, Priscilla does not hold her punches. And you will see in this presentation, she starts off by basically ripping apart the title of the conference. So everyone, please put your hands together for the fantastic Priscilla.
Hi, sorry I can't be there with you. And we're here to talk about creating certainty in a world of change, but I'd like to begin with a simple statement that just simply says we do not create certainty in mining. And in some cases, the pursuit of certainty actually makes our decisions worse. And that may sound counterintuitive, especially in a room full of engineers and scientists, regulators, and investors, whoever is here. But I want to suggest that what we really do, what we must do, is something different. We make defensible decisions under an irreducible uncertainty. So let's be honest about the systems we deal with. Our ore bodies are heterogeneous, incompletely sampled, and scale dependent. Tailings facilities are evolving landforms, partially saturated, internally variable, and only indirectly observed. Water systems change over time, seasonally, climatically, and in response to our own interventions. And all of this unfolds over decades. So when we approve a design or sign off on a facility or certify a system, what do we actually do? We are not verifying performance. We are making a judgment about how the system is expected to behave based on incomplete knowledge. But here's where I think we get into trouble. We begin to confuse confidence with certainty. We say things like, the model shows this, the factor of safety is acceptable, the system is compliant, there have been no alarms, and slowly these statements accumulate into something that feels like certainty. But each of those statements has limitations. Models are abstractions, factors of safety are conditional, compliance is procedural, and no alarms is not a performance argument. In fact, one of the most dangerous conditions in our field is this: when nothing appears to be wrong and we stop asking what might be, this is what I call the certainty illusion. We are constructing what I would call this certainty narrative, a story that allows us to ourselves, to regulators, to investors, to communities, allows us to say the system is understood, the system is under control. But the reality is more complicated. We cannot fully observe these systems. We cannot test them at full scale before they exist, and we cannot predict all future conditions, especially over long time frames. So the question becomes, if certainty is not achievable, what should we be aiming for? What is the goal? I would suggest that the goal is not certainty. The goal is defensibility, and defensibility has a very different structure. Defensibility requires that we can clearly articulate what assumptions we made, what failure modes are plausible, what conditions could trigger those failures, and what the consequences would be. And then we also want to know what we are monitoring, how we interpret what we observe, and what actions will we take when observations diverge from expectations. This is a chain, an explicit, testable, and revisable chain. And importantly, it does not require us to claim that we are certain. It requires us to show that we are being prepared. So let me show you what I mean. In this drawing, the top band is what we believe will happen, our assumptions, models, anticipated consequences, and the bottom band is what we actually observe and how we respond over time. And the gap between them, that's not an error, that is the condition that we are managing. Defensibility is how we deal with that gap. And this overall loop that we can see is where defensibility is earned. Defensibility is earned through learning, through revision, over time. So we reach the conclusion that time matters. And responsible certainty, if we want to use that word at all, does not come at the beginning. It emerges over time. At the moment of design approval, uncertainty is actually at its highest. And then over time, we observe, we compare, we reconcile, and we adjust. But even here, we need to be careful because more data does not automatically mean more understanding. And pattern recognition is not the same thing as an explanation. So the real task is not just to collect data, it's to interpret performance responsibly over time. So what does this mean for responsible raw materials? If we take this seriously, 4 things change. First, from certainty, we change to transparency. We must be explicit about what is not known. Second, from compliance to acceptability. Compliance is not the same as safety or trust. Third, from design completion to performance stewardship. Responsibility begins after approval. And fourth, from confidence to accountability. Decisions must be explainable and revisitable. So I will close with this. Certainty is not something we achieve. It's often something we claim. However, defensibility is something we earn over time through observation, judgment, and accountability. And perhaps the most responsible thing we can do as an industry is to be honest about the difference. Thank you.
As always, the wonderful Priscilla Nelson. I'm sure you'll agree with me that that was a fantastic talk that she sent in. And it's only 7 minutes long. What a glorious thing to be able to go back and listen to again. I really love the fact that she talks about how often we kid ourselves with certainty. And Grace, certainly from, think about tailings dams. How many engineers have we worked with where people go, oh, but it's not designed to fail. Yeah, but it could. And actually, that's what we're then talking about. But that requires quite a big leap of people being allowed to be vulnerable, perhaps, in terms of what they're doing there. And I think some of what she talks about, there's quite a lot of parallels in the world of human and organizational performance, or HOP. And so people in the world of health and safety, etc., talk about that quite a lot, where people talk about work as imagined versus work as done. So it's really interesting. It's similar concepts coming in from the world of psychology and behavioral science, but then also the world of engineering. So massive, massive thank you to the wonderful Priscilla, and we hope that you're enjoying yourself off in the middle of the field. So big thank you very much to Priscilla. Next up, we have a really exciting surprise for everybody. Well, it's not a total surprise, but you may have noticed that on the screen we now have 2 people with the same surname. And this isn't just by chance. It's because you're related, aren't you? So we've got 2 A. Durans on the call with us at the moment. Anthony, you're Aileen's brother, aren't you? Just being totally
Yes, I am.
transparent.
And I have to admit, I'm the older brother as well, as you might tell from the grey in my beard.
No comment, no comment. But Anthony, I don't know if you've got slides that you want to share. Now is a good moment to start clicking those
Yep.
buttons. Aileen, just while we're waiting for your brother to share his slides, would you like to introduce him?
Oh God, yeah, no pressure. So Anthony is my brother, in case you did not know. So Anthony does not come from a geosciences or raw materials background, but he does come from a biological and bioinformatics type background, and I'm likely going to butcher this. But today Anthony is not going to be talking about any of that, but he's going to be talking about diversification as a mechanism for certainty. So it builds really nicely on what Priscilla has just talked about, actually, and some of the kind of overarching themes and topics. So Anthony, over to you.
Yes, okay, perfect. So hopefully you can see my slides. Please interrupt me if you can. Okay, excellent. So firstly, thank you for the opportunity to come and speak. I have to admit, I'm really excited, mostly because I really enjoyed the last talk because it matches with what I'm going to talk about really well, just in a slightly different flavor with a slightly different perspective. So as Aileen mentioned, I'm not in geosciences and I'm not in engineering. My background is pretty much biotech, genomics, and bioinformatics, which is essentially kind of the handling of biological data. So in this talk, I'm only going to talk a little bit about biology and how in biology, diversity is actually a mechanism for certainty and what certainty actually means in the context of biology and how that can apply to real world systems. And I'm going to highlight a couple of examples under 3 key themes, which I'll come to in a few slides. So the first thing that I'm going to say is that if you'll notice on this slide, on my title slide, I actually have a path, right? I want you to keep this in your mind because at the end of this, hopefully you'll see why this path is very powerful because it is multiple different routes to the same destination. I think that's really key when something goes wrong. But what I thought I would start with is exploring what certainty means, right? And where does certainty come from? And why do people have certainty in certain systems or processes or in technologies? And really at a high level, I kind of broke this down into 3 key themes, which would be that often very simple systems are give people certainty, mostly to the extent because they're easily managed. There's a reduction in coordination costs. It's often very simple. These systems also are often very highly optimized for very specific use cases. And I'll highlight some examples of that in the middle of these slides as well. But another example that I kind of identified or want to talk about is familiarity. Sometimes the idea of being familiar with a process, maybe because that process has existed for a long time, that might be a technology that's been around for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. It gives people confidence because it's really well understood. And as a consequence of that understanding, there's a certain level of confidence and assurance attached to that technology or that system or that process. And then the last thing that I want to touch on, and I'll use these as my 3 kind of examples in my case studies, are wide scale use or wide adoption of a particular technology or approach. And again, this kind of gives people that sense of security because it might represent an established approach. It fits into that comfort zone of, well, everyone is using it, so it must be good, it must be safe, and almost provides a safety net of accountability for making difficult decisions and offers a safe alternative. But what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to highlight 3 examples in society related to not just biotech and not just the field, but just in general, where these ideas have really kind of created these challenges. And the examples I'm going to highlight, which probably everyone will remember, something like the Suez Canal. I'm also going to talk about legacy technologies and the risks associated with those. And I'm also going to look at energy volatility in a little bit of detail. And really what I want to get across more than anything is that these simple, familiar, widely adopted systems might give the perception of confidence and in a sense almost mask a lot of problems. And rather, the previous speaker spoke about like robustness, for example, or, oh, sorry, I'm jumping slides. there we go, spoke about robustness within systems and being able to prepare for that. Really what I want to talk about is latent uncertainty. So where you have a system that really looks well optimized, is very efficient, is widely adopted, represents a technology that's been around for a long time or an approach, but really as a consequence of that, we've built up these unknown unknowns or these other kind of risks associated with that. So I did say I was going to touch a little bit on biology to kind of start this out as an example. And really what I want to get across here is just taking evolution as an example, right? So one of the things that people often hear when we talk about evolution is something like survival of the fittest. But, that's a dramatic oversimplification. Really, another way of interpreting this, which is also probably a simplification, is survivability favors diversity. And really what I'm getting at is if you look at something like a biological system, and we'll take, an agricultural system, because it's a really obvious example of where this can go wrong. So we might have this collection of farms or this single farm, and we produce a single crop because we know exactly what we're getting. We can apply the same management system. It's a high yield producing crop. It's well understood. It's been around for a really long time. And this might seem like it provides certainty because we have a lot of confidence in this system, for sure. And the simplicity, the familiarity, and the wide use gives us that confidence. Whereas when we look at something like this, which is a little bit more diverse, a little bit more complex, the key point is it's also adaptable and it's also resilient. And what's really important here is that we're not deliberately trying to introduce complexity to the point of decision paralysis, or complexity to the point of being able to prevent you from managing this effectively. But this is ensuring managed complexity. And inherently, by having this type of managed complexity, it highlights vulnerabilities between components of that same system. So you get visible dependency between those components. And that's all really important for helping to identify risk factors associated. And a really good example, because this has happened many times in society, especially with monocultures and with agricultural species, is every now and again you get a pathogen or a fungus or something that comes along and wipes out essentially the majority of that monoculture because you lack genetic diversity that allows you to respond in different ways. And that's what I mean when I come back to the idea of survivability favors diversity. Essentially, diversity is kind of, in a sense, you can think of it like a tool belt. You have many different ways to respond to the same crisis. Whereas when you look at stuff like monocultures, they might be highly optimized for a specific question, which might be output or yield, but they tend to be much, much more fragile. And that's something that when we start to look at those examples that I highlight, so we'll take the Suez Canal as an example. Now, I'm not going to walk through all of the text here or anything, just really it's a lot there, but take the key section headers. But really what I want to get across with the Suez Canal, 12 to 15% of global trade passes through the Suez Canal. It's been around for a long time. It's very efficient. It's managed very well. It's a widespread use, of course. And all it takes is one minor crisis that wasn't well predicted. And all of a sudden, billions of dollars or euros or pounds, or whatever your currency is, gets lost in global trade, requiring alternative systems that then need to be put in place. And because of reliance on this single system, alternatives were never really fully developed or explored in the case of a crisis. And that's one of the things that is a risk with the reliance on oversimplified, over-optimized systems, is alternatives start to atrophy over time. And then there's a risk associated with trying to convert into those alternatives in a crisis situation, a very reactive situation. You don't control demand, you might be competing with other people, and you're not in a proactive situation. I think another good example, which I won't go into much detail, but would certainly be a good Google for anyone who wants to go into this, is looking at the just-in-time delivery system for markets and what happened in COVID, right? So these were highly optimized systems for delivering goods to supermarkets just in time to go straight into the market, with the goal of reducing the need for storage costs in like warehouses, for example. But obviously, when a shock came to the system, that was not prepared to handle and not robust. Another example, which I'll touch on, but there are many examples when it comes to technology, is the over-reliance on legacy technologies. So keep in mind, technologies tend to be built and optimized for the era in which they were developed, with the knowledge in which they were developed. And trying to kind of upgrade them or move them along is a continuous process. And if you were to take something as simple as the telephone, telephone was around for 80 years, was in everyone's home, everyone had one. And anyone who probably in the 80s was like, okay, it's just going to continue to grow as more people get telephones, I'm going to invest in this, really didn't see the trend as we moved into the 90s and 2000s, where internet was coming online, mobiles were coming online, and eventually you had voice over IP service providers like Skype entering the market, FaceTime, WhatsApp, Viber, all of these apps. And now we can do calling, and probably very few people have an actual physical telephone in their home nowadays. Why would you when you have a mobile phone? The same thing could be applied to, for example, the photography industry. Anyone that relied on a lot of the older technologies before digital came along, now everyone has a digital camera in their pocket alongside that calling option. So really the key point of this slide is that familiarity might breed over reliance, and that it's not about rapidly just jumping from technology to technology, but rather looking at diversified approaches to different problems. And that might involve, for example, having innovative adoption pathways alongside your current technologies. And a really good example of that is the last example I'll come to, is looking at energy, right? I always kind of say this phrase to myself: innovation means change, right? Change doesn't necessarily mean innovation, but really to adopt the best and most emergent technologies, you need to be somewhat aware and comfortable with the idea of change. But how do you become comfortable with change? By having resilience built into your system. So rather than relying on a single energy source, in this case, for example, and we can see for many people in Europe, for example, right now, volatility of oil has caused a spike in cost, for example, and countries like Spain or Portugal, which have a higher rate of renewables, are more resilient to this volatility. And that's kind of what I want to get across, that really, when we look at resilience in the context of energy, that means having diversified sources of energy and having that integrated into your system. And then the last thing, just as my last slide, because I know I'm at the 10 minutes and over, is really just to highlight that certainty can create this false sense of confidence. And that really, I think one thing we should be doing in the tech industry, for example, is challenging that certainty, because the risk of that overconfidence is, you facilitate monopolies, you potentially lead to stagnation by reliance on legacy technologies, but also you fail to see trends and fail to see risks in the system. And rather than relying on single over-optimized or highly optimized systems, it's probably better in terms of certainty to ensure that you have robust and diverse approaches to whatever it is, whether it's energy production, whether it's cloud providers, whether it's something else, for example. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you and highlight on the slide all of the things that can come up on the different paths, and that's why diversity is important, or diversification.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Anthony. Absolutely fantastic. Everybody, round of applause to the other Dr. A. Duran on the call that we have today. Anthony, in terms of leaning into that diversity breeds that robustness that we have here, but also as well pushing back on the complacency or potential complacency that we might have. Do you have any thoughts on like the recent innovations in AI and the latest version of Claude, for example, where they went, hang on a second, we cannot release this to the world because it's just finding all of the gremlins in, say, bank codes and stuff like that that are out there?
Yeah, a really great question. Mostly because AI is in this interesting space where it's a tool, right? But people are building it up as a panacea to every problem that exists. And it may become a solution to many, many problems. But where we are right now, it's probably not doing that. And I think a lot of companies are rushing ahead rather than looking to adopt this alongside their current processes. And a good example would be looking at tech industry making huge layoffs. And then I saw an article yesterday about how an AI chat like agent or an AI agent completely wiped an entire database for a car rental company. And that would have been something that was controlled by humans. And rather than adopting this technology alongside their current best practices, it seems like they kind of jumped right in there without kind of understanding what those risks are, because jumping right into AI is just keeping the same problem of having a single source of, in this case, like it might be management or it might be code development. And rather, what I see it is as an opportunity to kind of improve the efficiency of your workforce alongside these. So another good example that came up recently was IKEA took a chatbot and realized that 53% or something like this of all of their online chat could be handled by the chatbots, by anyone on their live chat. So they looked at the other percentage that wasn't and realized there was a lot of kind of opinion-based questions, a lot of how does this look good? How would I do this? So they reskilled all of their agents to have interior design skills so that they could handle that human interaction. I think that's a really nice example because they also increased their profits by over €1 billion, for example, which was a huge increase. And that I think that's a really great way to look at the integration of any technology, not just AI, but with AI in particular. I'd just be a little bit cautious about how it's being sold and kind of positioned at the moment, at this very moment.
Yeah, and it's changing very, very quickly, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think to an extent it's also a little bit poorly understood from a risk perspective. Like, we had those examples of it doing its own thing and people not really understanding that. And that with the amount of money invested in so quickly, there's obviously a big drive to commercialize, and inherently that's creating risks is what I would say. So like I said, I think it will be a key technology going forward for sure. And I use it. You can see on my slide here, the very last line, AI tools used to generate images here. It is something that I think we should all be trying to become familiar with and understand its limitations, but it does have limitations for sure right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to invite Grace, who is one of our previous speakers in this session, maybe to come off mute, because Grace, you've written a fantastic comment into the chat, and I'll just spotlight you as well.
Yeah, the pressure. No, thanks, Anthony. I really, really, really loved your discussion. And yeah, I just wanted to say my take home was about optimization of systems. I think that's a topic that resonates in the mining industry because there's a really big discussion on optimization versus standardization in the industry right now. And your take home here was that over-optimized systems reduces your alternatives and increases your vulnerability really. So I think that's an absolutely fantastic take home in terms of where the industry's going right now and trying to, optimize everything. And they might actually be inadvertently, limiting their options and increasing their vulnerability. So yeah, that was a fantastic take home for me. Thanks for that.
I think that's great. Yeah, from my perspective, I'm really glad that's how you see it, because that is absolutely one of the messages that I wanted to get across is optimization is not a bad thing. Over-optimization or fixation on a single aspect is inherently risky in my opinion, or from my perspective. So I think that's really great that you found that useful.
And it's really interesting as well because So if you look at, say, capital projects and building of mines, for example, there's a lot of discussion within the mining sector right now why are we so bad at doing it? Because the vast majority of projects go miles over budget. So when your starting budget is 6 billion, then you are talking significant sums of cash, it goes miles over on time, etc. And one of the discussions I was in over the last few months was where people said, well, hang on a second, Chinese companies seem to be able to do this much better than a load of other organizations. And so the discussion was, well, why? And one of the answers was, well, actually, they only have 4 different types of bridge. And so when you say, right, I need to build a bridge, instead of designing it from scratch or being very context specific, apparently, according to this discussion, they go, right, do I go with bridge A, B, C, or D? And so everybody thought, oh, well, that's a very good idea. But I think with that, of course, you are building in vulnerabilities into that system because you're simplifying it to the detriment potentially of oversimplification. But do you think, Anthony, there's almost the space for a bit of both in the world?
Yeah, for sure. Like I kind of mentioned, innovation is change, but change isn't innovation, right? If you have too much happening and too much disruption, inherently that will also create uncertainty, right? There needs to be a bit of a balance between both for sure. And I think, over reliance on a single or small subset of options is obviously risky, but also changing every 6 months is obviously incredibly disruptive. And for sure, depending on the industry that you work in, they will be more tolerant to one versus the other. If you're working in, say, for example, a commercial industry where you have customers and end users, like take the mobile phone, if you were pushing updates to that every week, for example, or if there was a bug found every 2 weeks, for example, you would inherently, people look at it as not a stable technology, not ready for wide scale use. And that's to an extent why some apps over time have died off, is because they were just not stable enough, even if they were innovative. But the ones that really have stayed around them longest, and take the iPhone as an example, they're a market leader now. They've like a huge market share. They came along, they were disruptive, they were innovative, maybe less robust than they are now at the beginning, for sure. But, over time, they've managed that innovation versus kind of robustness approach quite well. In a lot of ways, in other ways, probably less so. So, yeah, I think, to be successful, it is about balancing those two things. And I would say maybe a way in which to do that is kind of taking a step back and looking at where you have those vulnerabilities and trying to identify those hidden vulnerabilities where innovative adoption technology or emergent technologies may support kind of resilience in the system.
So, final question, and leaning into those hidden vulnerabilities, do you have any suggestions as to, or thoughts on what are the most effective ways for an organization to recognize those hidden vulnerabilities early and then perhaps a bit more proactively invest in that diversification, that resilience?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think because I'm aware of time, I'll use a phrase that I've started adopting in the last year and a half or 2 years since I learned it, because I really like at least how I interpret it. It's a disagree and commit. I think it's an Amazon phrase. And the idea that I take from this is you should have a company culture or a workspace that promotes the idea of openness, being able to discuss difficult conversations, throw out ideas that maybe conflict with each other, but in a very positive direction because you're all moving towards the same result. And then have a full and wide understanding and exploration of those risks. And then once you make that decision as a company that this is the step that we're going to take, and then maybe a step after that, everyone gets on board and works together to deliver that quite effectively and efficiently. And I think that as a culture probably would help enable our staff or enable our people to do that for us, for example.
Beautiful. And if you ever want a job in a risk management consultancy, come and have a chat, because that was a beautiful description of what I think good risk managers, etc., try to do. But Anthony, full disclosure, that last question was from your sister, so you can blame her for
I
all
will, because that I wasn't ready for at all.
Well, it was a great answer. So everyone, please put your hands together for the fantastic Dr. Anthony Duran.
Thanks,
Excellent.
everyone.
Cheers, mate. Thank you. Brilliant. So on the subject of risk management, we're now going to welcome to the stage the fantastic Jan Henk. Now, Jan, of course, is dialing in from the Netherlands. And just to start our little fireside chat that we're now going to have, Jan Henk, who are you? Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, I happily introduce myself. Jan Henk, I'm a geologist. And I will always be a geologist. Somebody early on in my career told me that at some point in your career, you leave your profession behind and you become an integrator, which is true. I did become an integrator, but I did not leave that geology part of me behind. So I apologize to Malena for asking her question about cobalt before. It intrigues me though. So yeah, who am I? I'm a geologist. I did a PhD in Zurich a long time ago, and then joined the oil and gas industry for this company with the yellow shell as its logo. Traveled the world with them for a large part of my career. Lived and worked in Malaysia, Brazil, the UK, Albania, and went to a whole bunch of other countries as part of that. And then in 2021, made the switch into mining exploration, which was a whole new field and insightful at it. So that's a very short version of who am I. In the course of those nearly 30 years, I did a lot in risk management, and risk management has become my basic toolkit to go to when approaching, frankly, any problem.
So with that, just to start with basics, and I realize I'm going off script of what we discussed already.
That's fine.
When you say risk or risk management, what does this actually mean to you?
It's a great question, especially in the context of the theme of this conference, right? A risk is different from an uncertainty. An uncertainty is something you do not know the boundaries of, and you're trying to define the boundaries of. A risk is an event that can happen that can adversely affect the project you're undertaking, or the question you're trying to answer, or the job you're trying to do. So I'd like to make that distinction.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, go ahead.
No. So I guess a risk is an uncertainty that we actually care about.
If it affects what we're trying to do, yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. On you go. Back to you. I will stop interrupting.
No, so I was actually going to reflect back on something that Priscilla said on uncertainty and certainty, and I wholeheartedly agreed with her statement there. That defensible decisions are taken under irreducible uncertainty. That means that if that irreducible uncertainty provides a risk to whatever you're trying to do, develop a mine, explore for a new deposit, manage the water in the operation you're handling, or closing a mine, you need to understand what the boundaries of that uncertainty are, and see to what extent you can reduce them till you get to that irreducibility point. And I think that a large part of what we do is actually that. How do we reduce that uncertainty to that point of irreducibility? That doesn't mean that we have certainty at that point in time. And that's where I completely agree with what Priscilla was saying. Is that you don't have certainty. There's still a lot of stuff you don't know. And risk management is then handling how you're going to respond to the eventualities that exist within that irreducible uncertainty space.
And is risk management just a reactive thing then? Are you responding to something, or actually is it a bit more proactive?
I think it should always be proactive. And I think this comes to one of the big things I think I'm trying to do, which is scenario planning, right? If you know what the irreducible uncertainty space is that you operate within, then you can start asking yourself the what if questions, right? What if this goes wrong? What if that goes wrong? What if that goes wrong? What would our response be? And how would we monitor that is going wrong? So I think asking those questions, asking the what if questions and asking them really in depth, right? Analyzing them is absolutely critical if you're operating in an irreducible uncertainty space.
So with that, if we think about, I guess the rate at which the world is changing or perhaps surprising us at the moment, let's go back to your time in the energy sector when you worked for the company with that sort of Shell logo. You're the one that said it, Jan-Henk. I haven't given the game away here. I mean, I certainly have been part of conversations back in the day where I was saying, right, well, what if the price of oil falls below this or goes above that? And people wouldn't believe me. People would say, oh, it's never going to fall that low, or it's never going to go that high. Do you want to just describe to us maybe some of the, risk management, etc., from your oil and gas background, etc., and but then also lead into how do you get people to think a bit more outside of the box?
Yeah, great question. I'm going to start very high level answering that question. Shell and BP both have scenario planning groups, and they publish these scenarios online. You can go on their website to actually read through them, and I would urge anybody on this conference to actually do that because they have a lot of really good information in them. And what they do is that they publish these every 2 to 4 years, doing intermediate update to them. They basically sketch a long-term vision of how the world could develop in different directions. And they sketch a number of different scenarios. And one of the ones, the Oceans and Mountains, was the one that Shell developed at the end of the previous decade, so in around 1990 to 2019. And it actually described the world we're in at the moment, the fragmentation, the geopolitical fragmentation that is ongoing. So that's the high level point where I'm going to start. So there are tools out there and there are people out there that are actually thinking about this over a longer period of time and trying to extrapolate trends. It sort of comes back to Anthony's point earlier on diversification, right? It's how do you prepare for the different eventualities? And I think those scenarios give you a guideline of what directions you could expect as a business the world to develop in. Now, if you then reduce it back down to an individual project or an individual problem you're trying to handle, one of the critical tools that I've used a lot in my career is opportunity framing. Just sit down. And it's a very simple tool in its essence, right? Where are we now? Where do we want to be? How am I going to get there? But you can use it to such an extent that it really makes people think about what they're taking as given, challenging those givens, then what do they want to do with that? Where do they want to go? And what could derail them on that journey to that endpoint? And I think that is a really good and simple tool to take a step back, think outside the box, and look at the risk that you could envision, but also the opportunities those risks could bring, right? Risk and opportunities are interchangeable, in my opinion. Every risk brings an opportunity.
Yeah, and I mean the official definition of risk is that risk is both potential threat and potential opportunity. The problem is that the English language tends to put risk in the negative bucket only. Exactly. And so we find, people doing climate change risk assessments, you have to talk about risks and opportunities, which, being really technical, means you're talking about threat and opportunity potential, which is a really good weighting because it makes the world a happier place. But just thinking about the opportunity framing, Jan-Henk, I guess one of the tricks with that is if you say, right, where are we now? Where do I want to be? And how am I going to get there? Or how could we get there? That whole where do I want to be? We have to be so honest about what that really looks like. And going back to, say, Rini's talk from earlier on today, if we say, I just want to earn lots of money and I don't care about the impact on anybody else, that is a very different destination compared to saying, actually, I would like to make sure we have these materials available to us whilst also enhancing and delivering value in all kinds of different ways. So everybody involved within that system. That's a very different destination, is it not?
Yeah, and I think you touch on a point which is really important, which is you never undertake this in isolation, right? If I say I want to make a lot of money, it's all about you, right? It's not about the system within which you operate, and you cannot look certainly not at a resource project, be it oil and gas, be it mining. You cannot look at that in isolation. You are operating within a wider system with a whole set of stakeholders that you need to inform and involve. And I think a number of the talks today from Grace, from Rini, have touched upon that very eloquently. That the way we bring those stakeholders into the conversation is absolutely critical in how we plan the next steps in a particular project. And I think that's one of the things I realized when I made the switch from oil and gas to mining. Mining is a lot more attuned to the local the local regional community stakeholders, because mining almost always takes place on land, right? And they have to deal with the people within whose communities they're operating. Oil and gas can be really arrogant about that.
You said it.
I've said it. Really arrogant about it. Oil and gas, on the other hand, is a lot better at advocating at government or supra-government level, right? Which is something that mining needs to start doing, because if we want to reliably and responsibly provide the world with the resources that we need to continue evolving as a species, and I'm making this very broad now, we do need to make sure that we have buy-in from the person whose farm we're impacting all the way up to the people in the city that are actually consuming the goods that we're producing.
Yeah, and I think with that, so actually just going back to what you were saying about the arrogance of oil and gas, just because I want to dwell on that for a moment. But actually, I think it's a case where so I was lucky enough to run a conference back in, I think it was 2018, where we brought together people who are part of the oil and gas sector or the energy sector and people from the mining sector, and the theme was risk management. And I thought, you know what, we can share lots of learnings with one another. And the mistake that we made was that we ran parallel sessions. And what happened? All of the kind of the more technical sessions, all of the oil and gas people went to those. And all of the sessions that were more to do with social aspects, etc., all the mining people went to those. So we didn't get that kind of cross-contamination, as it were, or pollination of those ideas. And something kind of really struck me. I think that from a UK perspective, where oil and gas has been so dominant over the last few decades, we really look to oil and gas and say, oh, we are really good at health and safety, risk management, things like that. And so there's perhaps a bit of an inferiority complex with regards to saying, we want to learn from you, or we want to learn your good practice. But we don't go in and say, but by the way, we are really good, or we're not really good, we are better perhaps at that understanding the social environment. So especially where oil and gas is working in, unconventionals, so where there is drilling that is on land rather than in the ocean. So it's something there which certainly back in 2018, I didn't crack it in terms of working out how do you get people to actually realize that we can share strengths with one another. So you've got that diversification of opinions, etc., and learning, rather than just thinking it's a one-way thing because one group of people are better than the others. What do you think?
It's an interesting observation. I think you highlighted the technical versus the social one, and I think that's a very interesting one, because most oil and gas people that go to conferences like that and manage safety come from a technical background and have worked as technical people in the other organizations, engineers. A lot of the people that work in the ESG side of mining have a much more social economic background.
Yeah.
And they speak different languages. They do speak, and I think this conference already showed it. I think there's different languages being spoken, and frankly, engineers are not comfortable talking about social issues. They really aren't. So I think that is one aspect. I wanted to make another point that linked to this, and now it's escaped my mind, and it had to do with how mining approached. Sorry, it slipped my mind.
It's okay. It's okay.
It will come back.
So in terms of how do we provide the right environments or encouragement or make people feel safe enough so that the engineers can go and have those conversations with social experts. And I'm not sure if Rini is still online with us at the moment, but she will remember over the last few years we've run lots of sessions where we've tried to bring together transdisciplinary groups of researchers. And Rini, I don't know if you want to comment on this, but it's been absolutely fascinating in the room where you've got some of the world's best engineers, and yet sometimes they don't feel they feel quite scared sometimes to share their opinions because they don't want to offend someone, or they know that there's a language there that then they're not quite tapping into. But I think, and then in another case, it might be the social scientists, etc., who maybe don't want to come into the conversation. And so it's really interesting trying to create that environment where people feel comfortable enough to share their perspectives. I don't know, Rini, if you want to say anything to that.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, we just recently actually had a kind of workshop in ANU here between the social and technical experts involved in the Center for Future Materials. And we kind of thinking about what kind of protocols should be there to guide us to work together, interdisciplinary. And the first step was actually to check whether because sometimes we talk about one word, kind of like one vocabulary that we thought it's the same meaning between engineer and anthropologist, for example. That is not, right? Sometimes it's totally different. And the first step that we thought about working together is to understand everyone's coming from different expertise. They will have different worldviews that shape them because they went through different trainings, and to have that trust and respect. So there you go. You basically summarize that better than me there. That's the requirement for working together.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because I think that the barriers, be they real or imagined, in terms of being able to see the world through different eyes and then having the confidence to have those conversations, the confidence to appear to be silly sometimes as well in front of other disciplines who we really respect, can sometimes be really tough. And I think, Jan Henk, coming back to yourself, I mean, this is something where, be it oil and gas, mining, which, you know, from the surface look like very similar sectors, there are actually quite big differences, I guess, between them. But ultimately, when you're doing your risk management, you know, you're thinking about that opportunity framing, etc., being able to encourage people to be brave enough to think outside the box or say things that might be quite uncomfortable. I suspect that is a key part of it.
Correct. I think, and the first thing that came to mind when you brought this point up, Sarah, and listening to Rini, is how do you create, and this is a concept from HSE, right? How do you create psychological safety in the room? How do you make it possible for everybody to be heard? And I'm going to park Rini's comment on using language that uses the same word means completely different things, because that's a different question that we need to explore as well. But I think the concept of psychological safety and creating the space where people one of the important things that circling back to opportunity framing, one of the important things at the start of an opportunity framing, I always find, is this, that you need to make a statement that there is no rank in the room. You need to a priori try to create that space where everybody can feel comfortable in speaking up. Sort of Chatham House rules, right? That's what it comes down to. Only when you get the diverse input from different stakeholders in a room can you truly start to put the boundaries on that uncertainty you're trying to manage and try to reduce it to that irreversible uncertainty that Priscilla was talking about. I do think it is important that if you do that, you actually document what that irreducible uncertainty look like. Try to describe it, be very specific about it. Because if people later on challenge the decision or the direction you drew from that, you can actually say, well, this was the information we had available. This is what we knew at the time, and that was what that decision was based on. So I think back to the theme of the conference, certainty in a changing world. Well, certainty is a fallacy, right? It really is. It is about how do you manage uncertainty, and change is always with us, which means uncertainty will always be with us. And therefore, in my mind, you should always look at the world through that lens of uncertainty and ask yourself the what if question, because the what if question is the most powerful question you can ask.
I think that is a beautiful note to finish on. Jan Henk, thank you so much for coming along and speaking with us here today. I know there will be more conversation happening in the chat. Everyone, please put your hands together for the fantastic Jan Henk. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Cool. Okay, so we are almost there, folks, with regards to today's session. And I don't know about you, but my brain feels like, on one hand, it's swimming in this warm bath of being able, being inspired and thinking about all of these different concepts. On the other hand, it's feeling a little bit fried, overwhelmed, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Next to the stage, we welcome the absolutely phenomenal Fiona Clowder. Now, Fiona, I guess we started appearing in the same conferences or so a couple of years ago. Fiona's background is very much from that diplomat perspective, having been the UK's ambassador to Chile and then regional ambassador, and very much leading on and shaping a lot of the broader strategy, I guess, with regards to South America. I'm really delighted to welcome Fiona to the stage here today. Fiona, if you want to start sharing your slides, etc., feel free to punch the buttons in now. One of the things that I think has been really great about this year's conference, as is always the case, is that it's very tempting to do sessions that just focused on, be it a particular theme or a particular geography. But actually, as we're seeing here, it's really important to be able to connect the dots and pull on all of those different strands from across the world. And so with that, we've talked a little bit about the DRC and Zambia earlier on today. We're now going to hop across the South Atlantic and we're going to go to Latin America. So with that, please, everyone, put your hands together for Fiona Clowder.
Well, Sarah, thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you also for the opportunity to participate in this really interesting conference. And I've been listening to some of the other speakers and learned a great deal this morning. And I'm by no means any expert on any of this, but I enjoy learning from others and also trying to look at some of the bigger picture. So I'm not going to be talking about the detail of mining. I think that's for the other experts in this conference. I'm going to be talking more about the overall picture, some of the concerns, and also I very much agree with what Priscilla was saying about the title of the conference. We can't create certainty, but it's how do we manage some of those risks? How do we create greater resilience in the system? And how do we build awareness of what's ahead of us? So hopefully you can see my slides, and perhaps for those of you who thought you were dialing into a mining conference, you might wonder from this one, are you in the right place? But this phrase of est tardi is something that I used a lot when I was the regional ambassador on COP26 for Latin America and the Caribbean, because I feel that time is slipping away from us. And this is something we're not thinking about enough in the world of mining, and why mining is so important for our world of the future. And of course, a lot of the discussion, a lot of my own interest in this comes originally from the drivers of climate change, and hence the needs of the energy transition, with the energy transition, of course, requiring a vast increase in mineral production. And 4 years ago, when I first got involved in all of this, I asked the question, are we looking at the equation of what's needed versus the capacity of the mining industry to produce? And I think a further dimension of that is, are we looking at the capacity, the realities in a changing world, and the timescales involved? And we're running out of time is what really concerns me. But I do feel also there's a fantastic opportunity for Latin America. And I deliberately use the word for rather than in Latin America, because I do feel from Western governments, from Europe, from US, we've just been talking about some of this at a conference I'm currently at in Madrid. We tend to talk about what's in Latin America, whereas actually this is a moment for the region, for the individual countries, which are of course all very different. But this is their moment in the world, because Latin America, of course, has a lot of what the world needs for the future, for the energy transition, for economic security, and indeed mineral needs for defence and security in an increasingly uncertain world. But I also think it's important that we understand that the perspective from Latin America might look a little different. And I've always liked this image from a Uruguayan artist. And something I learned from my time in Chile is the world looks a different place, as it were, from if you view the world from a convention of what might be seen as upside down. But relationships for countries in Latin America are not necessarily always looking northwards, nor are they always looking to Europe or to America. And that's perhaps something we need to bear a little more in mind, and to listen more about what the region both has to offer, what the region needs, and where we can build real partnerships. And I think this concept of partnerships is very, very important. So there are all sorts of statistics from all sorts of different sources. This is from the World Bank. I think probably a few years ago. There's excellent analysis from the IEA, from IRENA and others. But the picture is the same, that the volume of mineral resources needed is multiple values of what is currently in production. There is, though, general consensus that there are enough reserves in the world of the different minerals that are required, but there are differentials between the different minerals themselves, as others have been talking about, ease of production, and also the whole issue of processing and all the logistics that goes along with that. Recent analysis from the IEA has looked in more detail in different scenarios about those supply gaps, because what's clear when I got involved in all of this through the climate change world, we're looking very much at the goal of net zero by 2050, and recognizing that to meet that goal of net zero, a large number of measures needed to be put in place by governments, by industry, in all sectors all over the world. And that needed to go 5 times faster than it was to achieve what was needed by 2030 to meet the trajectory for 2050. We're now getting pretty close, actually, to that point. And of course, for all sorts of reasons, governments have perhaps lost focus and momentum and change of views on net zero. The supply gaps are there. They are different for different materials. But also in an increasingly uncertain world, we have more problems actually in production. And so what I feel, going back to the timescales, is we're not always thinking about in what time frame do we need to address these supply gaps, and are we putting the measures in place now to try and reduce those risks. And those risks are not just about getting the stuff out the ground, it's also about the money involved, it's about the people, the skills, the capacity, the infrastructure that is needed to deliver this work. And of course, also mining itself is not something that can be turned on or off overnight. The average for a mine to go from exploration to production can be decades, an average of over 16 years. We haven't necessarily got 16 years for the volume of both new mines and increasing productivity that is needed. And this is where technology is going to play an ever more important role. Other speakers have also talked about some of the pressures and tensions in mining, the very important relationships with communities. And I always think this is a very powerful slide, looking at the concurrence of those different risks of water, of conflict, of food insecurity impacting on communities in the very areas where mining projects are located. But we're also seeing, I think, progress across the world in recognising the importance of engaging with communities and not just doing this in a tick box ESG type exercise, but about building real partnerships right from the start of considering possible exploration through to all the stages that are involved in the mining life cycle. And also, it's not just, of course, about getting the stuff out the ground. It's very much about the processing side of things and ultimately creating value-added products. And there, of course, we see huge domination by China in terms of processing capacity. And that in itself raises, I think, particularly important considerations. We, of course, have a very different approach by the US and a desire by the US to exclude China from much of the processing and production chains. I think there are real questions about how realistic that is. But also with regards to Latin America, I think it's very important we respect and understand that countries there have very different dynamics in their relationships. Both China and the US are important to countries in that region, and trying to force a choice is not in anybody's interest. Another issue that I feel that we're not thinking about enough is, will it become too hot to mine? Climate change is happening. Whilst governments may have moved away from their intentions on net zero, that reality is ever looming. And that reality is going to exacerbate some of the risks that we've been talking about, particularly in relation to communities, to water, to energy, etc. And so I think there's a real issue that needs looking at further, is the increasing risk that climate change itself will affect mining, which is the very thing that we need more of in order to address climate change. And also there's the money. None of what we've been talking about today and in other conferences can happen without the necessary capital. And there are all sorts of ways in which different forms of finance can contribute to mining, from direct investment to various royalty agreements, but also very, very much also the role of government in creating the right sort of investment environment that will attract that capital. Developing mechanisms between public and private sector to form partnerships. Also looking at this in a much more integrated way, that it's not just about the mining investment itself, but it's about the infrastructure and logistics that are needed to develop the sector, and ultimately to bring benefit to communities and to the economic benefit of the countries with these resources. And so large volumes of money are needed. Trying to make that happen is not easy. And of course, the very large mining companies are driven by the commodity markets and return to their shareholders. But also to address what is needed for the world of the future, the junior miners have a very, very important role to play. That's a much more difficult space to operate in, where often very small companies may have a particular land asset, are constantly looking for investment, and trying to mobilize that in a more coherent way is, I think, going to be very important in the world of the future. And so for the countries in Latin America, and why is Latin America so important? Well, for example, on lithium, Chile, Argentina, Brazil control over a third of global production. The lithium triangle, Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, has got roughly half the world's known lithium reserves. Chile, Peru, global leaders in copper, 35% of production, 31% of reserves. We've been talking about cobalt a lot this morning, and obviously the DRC, but it's important to realize that Latin America itself holds cobalt and other key minerals such as nickel, bauxite, niobium, and of course rare earths. And Brazil holds the world's second largest rare earth reserves. Also, countries like Chile are not just looking at copper, they're looking also to diversify on rare earths, cobalt, etc. And so the countries in Latin America who hold many of these commodity reserves have, of course, traditionally built their economies on those commodity markets. But it's very important to think now more about diversification of those economies, and particularly how benefits are brought back into country, economic and social benefits for the people of those countries. Also, the individual countries, understandably, are very much in competition with one another, but also there can be greater benefits, more alliances at local and regional level. And that's where both business and government partnerships can really help create that environment and mobilize capital. Governments have an important role to play in providing stability, facilitating licenses, coordinating infrastructure, and promoting collaboration, and ensuring that there is a stable fiscal and regulatory regime, because ultimately investors need that certainty, particularly going back to our theme today of a more uncertain world. There's been an excellent report just come out from the Institute of the Americas looking at critical minerals, looking at the Western Hemisphere's opportunity. I actually think that should be retitled to Latin America's opportunity. But that's a very detailed report that I recommend people have a look at if you're interested in this space. I also, though, just wanted to highlight a very important consideration, which is about the practicality of delivering these projects. This is a great friend of mine, Darren Quayle, who indeed taught me a great deal about mining when I was in Chile. And he's running an initiative, he now works for Warney. But it's a very interesting talk he gave at a conference, Resourcing Tomorrow, with the elephant in the room, which being Darren, he really did manage to get an elephant model, at least, in the room. But what he was saying is for all this intention, all this investment, all this drive on mining, the reality is that only 1 in 6 projects actually run on time and to budget. So even if all the predictions come off on mobilizing all the money that's needed to deliver all the projects that are needed to meet the timescales that are needed, actually the practicalities mean that there are huge delays. And a lot of those delays, and they seem to have got worse over the last decade rather than better, are actually about things that the industry is perfectly capable of resolving. And so a lot of this is to do with skills. It's to do with project management skills. It's to do with leadership. And also it's about drawing on technology, can address some of those delays to ensure the projects do come in on time and on budget. And so going back to that Institute of America's report, key things that were highlighted in that as recommendations were the importance of permitting, but to ensure that that's done in an efficient and time-certain way. Water, that huge issue we've been covering this morning, has to be given greater attention, really being seen as part of strategic infrastructure for the mining sector. The very, very important involvement of communities and local partnerships. Getting some convergence on the standards that involves. There's some great work been going on by the big institutions to try and consolidate and converge those standards, which makes it easier for everybody and creates a transparent environment in which the sector operates. Looking also at financial strategies and stockpiling approaches of governments, and to understand how that relates to the midstream processing. Ensuring that your infrastructure and processing facilities are co-located and optimized in a sensible way. Trying to take out the risks with various financial mechanisms and support on getting some of these processing facilities off the ground and off the ground quickly. Looking at traceability and rules of origin issues, and then also the very important issue of recycling, not just as a waste issue and a risk issue to be handled, but also looking at the capacity of recovery of minerals in that recycling process. And so a lot of this comes down to science and technology and thinking about how you can build those partnerships in a more strategic way. And again, I think that's a real opportunity where Europe and indeed America can link up with Latin America, indeed also Africa and other places in the world, to try and build real partnerships to mutual benefit, drawing on technology. And some of the needs of industry come down to that supply chain resilience, looking at alternative sources, handling of tailings, etc. Crucial issue of AI and automation, how technology can play a part in exploration, as well as increasing process efficiency and ore recovery. And also, of course, the whole issue of decarbonisation of the mining sector itself, as well as along with water usage. Very, very important to also look at biodiversity, environmental protection, how mining can be a more environmentally friendly, even environmentally positive activity. And thinking also about mines are not just about finding the stuff and getting it out the ground. Mines have a finite lifetime. So understanding that full life cycle, what happens at the end of a mine life, and restoration of land, very important. And of course, throughout all of this, issues of health and safety, automation, project management, skills development, leadership, etc. So I'm going to stop there, and Sarah, back to you and any questions. Thank you very much.
Fiona, as always, thank you so much. Absolutely fantastic. Massive round of applause for you. Now, I know we've got questions coming in, but a quick question from me first, if I may. And this goes really into your experience of being a diplomat. And when you are based somewhere like Chile as the ambassador for the UK, and so you're representing the UK, but building relationships that I suspect are deeply trusted relationships with different people within that country. How do you do that? Do you get given like a book from the FCDO saying this is how you do it? Or is it more you have this natural strength and skill and that's why you got the job?
Gosh, no. Well, I'd say with all due respect to my Foreign Office colleagues, I think things are a lot better now than when I got involved in all of this. So I got involved in the world of diplomacy a little bit by accident. My original career was actually in science and innovation, and I got more involved in international relations through that. And I eventually went to the Foreign Office to build a science and innovation network in our embassies around the world, and I work on science diplomacy. But so I came into diplomacy via a slightly strange route. Got involved with Latin America about 14, 15 years ago. I think it's been very much make it up as you go along. But I think the key thing is to actually learn from others. There is now far more structured training. And indeed, the countries in Latin America, and Chile is a very good example, Brazil, Peru, other excellent examples, have long established diplomatic colleges and a very rigorous training system, which we in the UK have been learning from. But you're right, a lot of this is about relationships. And I think you don't need to be a formal diplomat or an ambassador to do that. That's about all of us. And it's about listening. It's about trying to understand a little more, about trying to bring people together through forums like this. And I think diplomacy in the world of mining is very, very important. And we've all got a role in spreading that understanding. And so when I got interested in all of this, lots of my colleagues kind of said, well, what do you want to do that for? And thought it was a bit odd. But to me, this is about our world of the future. And so I think for all of us, including everyone on this call, kind of spreading understanding of why mining is important, what it means to all of us in our everyday lives, we couldn't live without it, and hence why it's needed for our world of the future, and how we can make that into a positive, as well as addressing some of the risks and concerns.
So Fiona, why did you get involved, or how did you get involved and make this sort of shift into the world of mining? What drew you in?
Well, it was really, in fact, I mentioned Darren Quayle when I was in Chile, and of course, mining is a very important part of Chile's economy. Darren taught me a lot about that, and then also, obviously, I learned very much from the Chileans themselves and from the big companies there. So I understood this was important. When I later got involved in climate change policy and the COP26 conference that took place in Glasgow, it seemed to me that we did make progress then in trying to move the world in understanding some of that. But nobody was actually thinking about where were all the materials going to come from for the energy transition. And I was due to retire from diplomacy anyway, and I had an opportunity to get a bit more involved in this. And I found it really interesting. And at first I thought I'd got it totally wrong and I must have misunderstood something really basic. But it turned out to be that there were these huge disconnects, and I think still are. It's getting better, but there's still big disconnects between the kind of climate world, the energy world, the mining world, and ultimately the finance world that's needed to make all this happen. And so I think, again, all of us can play a role in talking to one another and trying to build understanding and look at how we can help move this forward.
Yes, it's amazing actually how instrumental COP26 was at, I think, kind of getting us over that tipping point of no, hang on a second, this is important. Because whilst I realised there were thousands and thousands of people at that conference, I was also there and representing geoscience in the UK, and absolutely astounded that there was this misconception that these raw materials, what they just synthesize from thin air. Like, where do they come from? And also, I think as well the misconception that that mining is just coal mining, and not the minerals and metals and aggregates and everything else. So it was absolutely fascinating with regards to that. There are two questions that have come through in the chat, if I may. But Fiona, if you do need to go, just wave at me.
It's fine. It's fine.
And the first comes from Grace, who of course is staring at you now. So Grace, we can blame you for this. But Grace is asking, do you see the primary role of Europe and the UK as a mechanism to provide capital for the development of Latin American resources? Or do you see other key, I guess, ways of collaboration for Europe and the West to support or work with Latin America?
Right. Well, I think I'd like to say yes, but I think we have to be realistic. And so Europe and the UK can, of course, provide some of the money, but the US is really, really dominating in the role it's playing, both in terms of direct investment and also in terms of some of the geopolitical drivers and alliances. And we saw, for example, in February, Rubio brought together key countries from across the region to talk about critical minerals. UK was also involved in that discussion. We've seen broader initiatives from the US, for example, on the Shield of the Americas initiative in March. But we're also seeing initiatives by Europe. And interestingly, only last Friday, there was the signing of the US-Europe relationship on critical minerals and in relation to Latin America. So I think the Western forces are coming together. There are also other players in this space. Sarah, you and I were recently in Riyadh at the Future Minerals Forum, and Saudi Arabia and others from the Middle East are also taking a greater interest in Latin America. And so this comes down to how do you mobilize that investment? How do you mobilize it at speed? And what can different players bring to the party? And so going back to your question, I think being realistic, the UK and Europe are not going to bring vast amounts of money. They'll bring some, but what else can those countries do? And that, I think a lot of that comes back to the research and technology. It comes back to also being conveners, shared values, and building wider alliances, for example, around infrastructure.
So I think as well, I mean, we've been involved in various conversations about sort of science diplomacy and all of that as well. And I think it is absolutely fascinating kind of working out what does the structure of that potentially look like? Because it's very easy to be inadvertently arrogant and say, we'll come and teach you all of this.
No, I think it has to be about mutual respect. And also very much the scientists in the host countries, they themselves have the detailed knowledge of the context in which they're operating. But it's can we bring something added to the party, and also in terms of developing, as it were, the wider ecosystem of how do you develop not just from the scientific knowledge, but how do you build that into relationships with industry? How do you then encourage spin-offs? How do you then further expand and develop your supply chains? What does this mean in terms of regional development? All these different things can layer and build on one another, where we've all got expertise to offer, but also we can all learn from one another.
Yeah, no, which I think is so, so important. One final question, Anthony, this question comes from yourself, and sorry, Grace, I should have invited you to ask your own question. But Anthony, do you want to pose your question to Fiona, and then we'll open this up to the broader panel?
Yeah, no problem. Sorry, I just kind of jumped in. I was really curious to get Fiona's thoughts on this because I really enjoyed that talk. I must also say a disclaimer, my partner's from Mexico, so Latin America is something I have a lot of interest in and a little bit of kind of knowledge. But my question kind of relates to local destabilizers within Latin America. And, you know, if we look at a number of countries that have gone through rapid political change in the last few years, like Chile, Peru, Bolivia, versus some of the more stable countries that are the largest economies like Mexico, Brazil to an extent, and even Colombia in the last few years. What do you see as additional destabilizers to be aware of? And do you have any thoughts on what the best strategies would be to work within this and around this potentially, for example?
Yeah, and some of this I think is also down to perceptions of the region. So you're quite right. Of course, we've seen enormous left-right swings, and that's very much part of the culture and history of Latin America as a region, that you get these big political oscillations. And linked to that, of course, you then get instability, sometimes social conflict, and that can be a very difficult environment for investors. But I think what we are starting to see is both individual countries adopting and developing the critical minerals agenda as state policy. So Chile is, I think, an excellent example. Mining is obviously fundamental and has been for centuries fundamental to the economy of Chile. Under the second administration, the late President Piñera, you had, I think, a very interesting strategy developed linking mining and energy. You had a minister covering the two portfolios. You then had a very different left-wing government come in under President Boric that has just come to an end, where, although obviously a very different approach and indeed a difficult time in the country following the social uprising, but fundamentally still driving that forward. And Chile, I think, has done some really great initiatives under the Boric government. We've seen the National Lithium Strategy. We've seen greater focus on community engagement. But we've also seen greater complexity in the system, and something called permissology is a big issue, where it's enormously complicated to get the necessary permitting through in a timely way. We now have the right-wing government of President Kast has just come in. And again, I think a very interesting merger, this time of mining with economy, which I think sends a very, very strong and important system of the fundamental importance of mining. And we've yet to see the detailed policies to be articulated. But I think we can be confident the direction of travel will continue to build in a very, very positive way in Chile. In Argentina, you, of course, have, whereas Chile is a very evolved mining economy, in Argentina, it's much more about the enormous potential. But we've also seen under the Milei government, things come in like the RIGI law to create a much stronger framework that encourages investment. And I think what we're also seeing across the region is many more alliances, much more joint approach, recognizing that the established mining countries have enormous expertise and experience to draw on, but also there are things that the newer players can bring. And in all of this, I also think there is the great issue of unexplored reserves. There is a lot about the countries in Latin America that is not yet known about the mining resources and potential. And also, I think we're seeing the big institutions like the IDB, for example, like CAF, also trying to take this forward in a much more coherent and coordinated way in relation to infrastructure and wider economic and social needs of the countries. So I think it's a very exciting time ahead.
There you go, Anthony.
Thank you. That was great.
Experience there, isn't it?
Yeah. Thank you.
Brilliant. So with that, Fiona, thank you so much for your fantastic insights. Everyone, round of applause for Fiona Clowder. Thank you very much. Brilliant. So we've got a few minutes left just to pull everything together. Now, as a reminder, in terms of what we've been through over the last few hours, so we started off with hearing from Rini, who is dialing in from the Australian National University in Australia, and she gave us insight to different types of values and how we might perceive those through the value chain or through the supply chain of mining. And she introduced us to terms such as value laundering and also value tension. And so I'm looking forward to seeing her research develop over the next few years in terms of value laundering and what she really means by that and whether it makes it, because it's great clickbait, even just by itself. Then, of course, we went from the world of social aspects and values into the world of geology. And Milena gave what I think is the best talk I've ever heard on what is going on with regards to the copper belt in the DRC and Zambia. Thank you so much, Milena. I'm going to be sharing that with many, many, many people because you made it so understandable and very pragmatic, I guess, in terms of what is actually there. So thank you so much for that. And then we hopped across to Grace, who talked about resource stewardship, and especially with regards to water, because water is one of those really annoying things. It doesn't sit within those boundaries of permits or license areas. It has this propensity to flow. And also as well, in terms of going beyond the life of an asset or what have you, it's one of those key aspects that we need to be thinking about as well. Then Priscilla gave her recorded talk that, again, I will be going back and listening to that a number of times. Firstly, she just destroyed the title of this conference because she said, Sarah, what are you doing? You should not be calling this certainty. But Priscilla, do you think we maybe did that intentionally to provoke this kind of outcome? So this was a case here where Priscilla just gave us so many great things to think about. And it's not about certainty, actually, it's about defensibility and moving to transparency, acceptability, accountability, all of those different aspects, which teed us up beautifully for Anthony. So the second Dr. A. Duran that we have on the call today. And Anthony brought in his experience from the biological world and things like evolution and the fact that diversity is a really good thing because that then allows us to be way more resilient and robust. And actually, if we were all the same, we probably would have been wiped out a long time ago, I think is maybe one way of looking at it. So yeah, diversity is a good thing. Then back into that world of risk and Jan Henk, where we talked about not only what we can learn from other sectors, but also opportunity framing. And instead of us thinking about certainty as being a bad thing, and in fact, maybe it's not certainty at all. So Jan Henk also was in the world of Priscilla saying that the name of conference was rubbish. So thank you very much for that, Jan Henk. Actually, this is about uncertainty and working out, well, where we can actually manage this, depending on what direction it is we're actually traveling in. And then finally, of course, we've just heard from Fiona, who not only has huge experience with regards to Latin America, but really thinking about, I think one of the first sentences you said, Fiona, was this is not about for Latin America, it's about in Latin America. And so how do we make sure that, or how do we all work together to ensure that actually those amazing resources that are sitting there in Latin America give the best opportunities for everybody concerned? It's not something where other countries around the world go and raid it, because that would be a little bit old-fashioned, shall we say. So given that those are some of the thoughts that we've been sharing in today's session, maybe if we just work our way around the room, and Grace, perhaps if I start with yourself, just to hear, are there any key thoughts you would like to share with everyone, or key takeaways, or things that made you go, I hadn't thought about it like that before? And then we'll go to Anthony.
Yeah, sure. I think from my side, the value laundering term that started the day was really impactful, because I actually kind of took that thought forward through all the presentations and every aspect people were talking about, and how you really need to think, well, actually, is this component intrinsically related to the stakeholders of the mine, or is it coming from somewhere else? So that was a massive, huge take home. Priscilla's presentation in particular around how we talk about risk and the fact and uncertainty, and there were a number of others that mentioned this too in their conversations, I think was absolutely right. There's extreme uncertainty all the time in mining, and it's how we manage that. And the one point that we probably didn't highlight yet that was made was, it's when nothing is going wrong that actually we're most vulnerable. And I just wanted to pick that one up and reiterate it, because that's when we get maybe complacent and think things are going well. I think Jan kind of was leaning towards that in his risk discussions as well. I really liked the again, I already mentioned with Anthony this idea that diversity really matters, and my head immediately took that into the engineering space, where you know, everyone wants to optimize down to the most minute amount of concrete or materials they need for lots of good reasons, but actually maybe thinking about the value, the intrinsic value of having those other options available to you in a time of change would be really valuable. Everyone, it was amazing. Thank you for inviting me to the panel. Everyone here did a fantastic job, and it was great to be a part of it.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Grace. Brilliant. Anthony, how about yourself? And then we'll go to Milena.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that kind of resonated with me throughout, in particular through the questions and the discussions. But I suppose first thing, which is always really nice, is we had a lot of different perspectives and different ways of looking at similar kind of problems. And I think that was really, from my perspective, really engaging. And I think really important that we're exposed to those different approaches or different ideas. But, you know, one of the things that kind of also resonated with me quite a lot is, again, this kind of idea that, you know, just because something works really well doesn't mean it can't improve and can't change. And that seems to be somewhat of a common theme across a lot of these discussions and talks. And that's something that I really like because you know, I think it's very easy to become comfortable with the way things are at the risk of them falling over unexpectedly and not being in a place to respond to that. So I think from my perspective, that's one thing I really enjoyed, was a lot of different approaches and views that really all complement and supplement each other in different contexts. So that's something that I thought was quite nice.
I love that. I think that, yeah, so just because something works doesn't mean to say it can't change. And I guess sometimes as well, things work really well for one bit of the system. And actually, but then for the broader part of the system, actually, that might be the need for some things to change as well. Brilliant. Thank you. Milena, let's go to the geologist, and then we'll go to Fiona.
I think that I want to summarize this panel with a word, which is integration. And with this, I want to thank the organizers, the organizing committee of this conference, for inviting the geologists. There's many geologists here, but to talk about specifically about geology. And I think it's a great step towards the integration of geology within all the policymakers and all the stakeholders. So yeah, I'm very glad that we start to see this integration of geology. And I think also a takeaway point from this session is that as a geologist, I have so much to learn about the social aspects of mining, and there's so many terms here that I wasn't familiar with. So I'm really glad that I took part of this, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of the sessions today and learning more about the social aspects of it. So thank you all for sharing your knowledge.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Milena. Yes, I think if we have one problem, it is often we have too many geologists in this conference every year, and that's because we're biased. We often have too many women. Can you ever have too many women? Fiona, over to you, and then we'll finish with Jan Henk. You're on mute, by the way, Fiona.
Thank you. Well, I've really appreciated learning from the geologists. So I think that's what's really important. And I guess what surprised me about this conference, which I've not been involved in before, is that range of perspectives. And I think that's a real added value that we should capitalize on more in the future. And also, I do feel this world of mining is very siloized. So it both doesn't necessarily talk or draw on other sectors, and even within mining itself, you've got all these specialities. And actually, I think we need to all come together much more, and also project out to others much more who are not involved in mining why all this stuff's important and why it impacts on them and why they might be able to help.
Yeah, exactly. Because we need to show people where they can help, I think, as well, don't we? And I mean, full disclosure, in terms of the way that we run this conference, so we always think, great, who do we want to get to speak? Who do we want to hear from? And then we write emails to everyone. We say, right, what's your availability? And that's how we do it, isn't it, Aileen and Miranda? We literally do it based on people's availability. And once that comes in, we then go, right, okay, here could be a bit of a story flow for each session, most of which goes out the window because some people change their minds as to when they might be available, which is no problem at all because we'll just roll with it. But it's fascinating because often people say, oh, but what's the theme of each session? We don't know until people actually share their thoughts and feelings. So Malena's already given us the theme for this session, which was integration. So thank you very much for that. But brilliant. Thank you very much, Fiona. And Jan Henk, any final thoughts from yourself?
I leave with a lot of optimism. I really liked the contribution of all the presenters, and I think what I particularly appreciated was that it was all grounded in how their particular aspect impacts society and how it links into the communities that we work with and within. And we cannot forget that that is who we are serving. And the fact that all of us touched upon that particular point in one way or another, and all of us identified problems, but also came with solutions, fills me with a lot of confidence that we humans are incredibly adaptable. And I think if we put the right minds together, we can climb mountains. And yes, the mountains that Fiona has sketched are very high and need scaling. It's as simple as that. And the only way we can scale them is, to use Malena's words, through integration of all the people around this call. And what I've heard today fills me with a lot of optimism. And on that note, I'd like to really thank you guys for organizing this, because putting such a diverse panel together is quite stunning. And I think it's been a phenomenal group of people. I've certainly learned a lot. I've certainly got a couple of people I'm going to reach out to for further contact after this. So thank you so much for doing that.
Absolute pleasure, Jan Henk. Thank you very, very much. And yeah, no, we always learn a huge amount as well. So with that, that's the end of this morning's session. And thank you very much to all of our fabulous speakers. It's been truly brilliant. But don't worry, folks, it doesn't end there. If you've decided that actually you prefer to be taking part in this conference than doing your work, as Lucy has already put into the chat. And we've got more starting at 3 o'clock this afternoon UK time. So that's in 4 hours time. And we've got a range of phenomenal speakers. We've got the likes of, so Gavin Mudd, he is the person behind the UK critical minerals list. So if you want to find out why the UK thinks certain things are critical or not, then it's all Gavin's fault. So come and listen to his rationale with regards to all of that. We've also got Melody McNeil, who comes from PAC. So this is an organisation that's fantastic and consists of a lot of people who used to work for USAID, and so really getting a very interesting perspective of the world. We've got insight from Kevin D'Souza on the coexistence with artisanal mining, so from conflict to coexistence. Are there any lessons that we can learn from all of that? Burak, who's going to give us some insight into risk management in infrastructure and large-scale projects and real estate, and many, many others. So please feel free to come along this afternoon and play with us with regards to the next set of conversations, or of course, everything is being recorded and loaded up online. This is about sharing our thoughts, our opinions, our feelings, and integrating with one another, because as Jan Henk and Anthony have been saying, our biology is pretty good. We're quite good at survival as human beings, but we all know that just because something is working well in some areas doesn't mean to say that it can't change. There we go, Anthony, I've stolen your words. So with that, thank you very, very much, everybody, and we'll see you in a few hours.